There's a certain kind of brain that ends up here. You know the one? It's late, you've already finished whatever you were watching, or maybe you didn't watch anything at all and you're just lying there with the lights off and your thoughts going in too many directions, and somehow you ended up on a Walking Dead theory video. That's fine. That's actually perfect. This is exactly the kind of video for that kind of brain. I've been thinking about this show for a genuinely embarrassing number of years, and one of the things I keep coming back to is how much of it still hasn't been fully picked apart. Not the big obvious stuff. Everyone's had the coma theory, everyone's done the any gun cliffhanger breakdown, everyone's argued about whether Carl's death ruined the show. I'm not interested in any of that tonight. What I'm interested in is the smaller stuff. The stuff you find at 2 in the morning on a Reddit thread that only has 47 upvotes. The theories that require knowing episode 3 of season 6 before they start to make any sense. The ones that, when you read them, make you go, huh, and then lie there thinking about them for longer than you expected to. That's what this is, 150 of them. And if you've already subscribed, thank you genuinely. This channel is a one-person operation, and it really does make a difference. If you haven't, just take a second and do it. It's free. Alright, that's the only time I'll mention it. We're going to go through these in loose thematic groups. The virus stuff, the Walker biology, the character theories, the CRM deep lore, all of it. Some of these are well supported by the text of the show. Some of them are completely speculative in a way that's more fun than credible. I'll flag which is which as we go, and we're in no particular hurry, so get comfortable. Let's start at the beginning. Let's start with the thing the show spent 11 seasons deliberately not explaining. The Walking Dead made a conscious, creative decision from day one to never explain where the virus came from. Robert Kirkman talked about this in interviews fairly early on. The thinking was that knowing the origin would shrink the world, would reduce a massive civilizational collapse to a single, explainable event, and that the mystery itself was more useful to the story than any answer could be. And honestly, for most of the show's run, that worked. The not knowing was part of the atmosphere. And then the spin-offs happened, and the spin-offs quietly started filling in some of those blanks. So now we have a partial answer, and a lot of theories about what that partial answer still doesn't explain. Here are the first 15. The Jenna reveal at the end of season 1 is one of those moments that, if you watched the show live, you probably spent the following week thinking about. Before Dr. Edwin Jenner destroys the CDC, and himself along with it, he whispers something in Rick's ear. Rick doesn't tell anyone what he heard until season 2, when he finally admits it in a quiet moment. Every living human being on the planet is already carrying the virus. It doesn't matter how you die, you come back regardless. And the thing is, when you sit with this theory, not just the reveal, but the implications, it changes the way you understand everything that happened before it. Jim, who was bitten in the season 1 camp attack, Amy, Andrea's sister, every single death in those first episodes, they were never going to stay dead. The group didn't know it yet, but they were living in a world where death had already been fundamentally redefined, and they just hadn't been told. The theory that gets discussed alongside this is that the universal infection doesn't just mean everyone reanimates. It means the virus was already optimized for this specific outcome before the outbreak began. It wasn't spreading person to person across the globe in real time, it was already there, which implies it was either present in the food supply, the water supply, or the air for long enough to have reached saturation before anyone noticed. And none of the spin-offs have fully addressed how that's possible for a lab-created pathogen. I don't have an answer, honestly, but the question is real. The whisper scene has been analysed frame by frame for years. The confirmed reading is, we're all infected, but there's a quiet theory, not well-sourced but persistent, that Jenner said more than that. That he told Rick something specific about his own test results during the brief medical evaluation the group underwent at the CDC. The CDC computers would have had blood work on every person in the building, and Jenner had been running tests for months. The reason this theory survives is what happens later. The CRM in the spin-offs specifically classifies Rick as an A, a designation reserved for exceptional individuals, people whose capabilities make them worth studying rather than just employing. And Jadis lies to protect him from that designation because A types in the CRM system end up in a laboratory. The question the theory asks is whether any of that CRM interest in Rick traces back to something biological rather than purely behavioural. It's speculative, but it's interesting. The World Beyond Season 2 post-credits scene is probably the most information-dense 30 seconds in the franchise's history. A biomedical lab in France, the words "Les morts sont nés ici," the dead are born here, written on the wall. A scientist rooting through old drives, watched by a man with a gun, who tells her that she and her colleagues were responsible for all of this. The official reading is that a research team in France engineered the wildfire virus, intentionally or not. But there's a competing theory that what the Primrose and Violet research teams actually did was discover a dormant pathogen, something ancient, possibly fungal or parasitic in origin, something that existed in nature in a non-virulent form, and then modified it, activated it. The distinction matters because a fully engineered virus would behave differently than a modified natural one, and some of the inconsistencies in how the virus spreads and mutates across different climates are easier to explain if the original template wasn't synthetic. The burning walkers in Daryl Dixon, which we'll get to later, are the most obvious evidence for this theory. A synthetic pathogen engineered in a controlled lab would be expected to behave consistently across environments. The French variants suggest it doesn't. Years ago, Kirkman floated the idea in a social post he later deleted that the Walking Dead virus originated from alien space spores. He walked it back fairly quickly, and the consensus became that it was a bit of playful misdirection. But here's the thing that keeps the theory alive in certain corners of the fandom. The lab origin story still doesn't fully explain universal reanimation, regardless of cause of death. If the wildfire virus is a pathogen, it should behave like a pathogen. Pathogens spread, they infect, they require a biological mechanism for transmission. But a person who dies of old age in a sealed room with no exposure to any carrier still reanimates. That's not how viruses work. That's not how anything works. The space spores theory, or any theory involving a non-biological origin, is the only framework that actually accounts for the universal infection without gaps. The show chose not to go there, and probably made the right call narratively, but from a pure logic standpoint, Kirkman's weird deleted tweet has never been fully disproven. The framing of the world beyond reveal positions the French lab as a tragedy of unintended consequences, researchers who created something catastrophic by accident. But there's a strain of theory that argues the framing itself is unreliable because the source is a man holding a gun on a survivor, which is not exactly a neutral narrator. The theory is that the wildfire project had a military application from the beginning, a pathogen designed to reanimate enemy combatants as biological weapons, soldiers who couldn't be killed with conventional firearms and who would continue attacking regardless of injury. The accident, if there was one, wasn't in creating the virus. It was in the containment failure that let it reach the general population. This would also explain the level of CRM infrastructure that exists so early in the timeline. An organisation that size with that kind of coordination doesn't form in the first 6 months of an apocalypse. It was already there, possibly managing the aftermath of something it was involved in creating. One of the most interesting implications of the Daryl Dixon spin-off is what it suggests about regional variants in the virus. The walkers Daryl encounters in France are different from anything seen in Georgia or Virginia. Some of them are faster. Some of them have a corrosive, burning quality. There are walkers in Season 1 of Daryl Dixon that appear to secrete something damaging on contact, which is not a behaviour the American walkers have ever displayed. The theory this generates is fairly straightforward once you see it. If the virus originated in France and spread outward, then the French variants represent later stage evolution of the pathogen in its place of origin, adapted to a dense, warm, urban environment over years of replication. The American strain arrived later, spread through a different population density, and evolved differently, possibly more slowly, possibly into a less aggressive form. Which means that what Rick and Daryl and Carol dealt with for 11 seasons was, by the standards of what exists in France, relatively manageable. And that's a strange thing to sit with. The CDC computers in Season 1, Episode 6 show Jenna running what appears to be multiple lines of research simultaneously. The famous TS19 file, the brain scan of his deceased wife, gets the most attention. But the theory is that the other data being processed in the background of those scenes represents a second research track that Jenna deleted along with everything else. Specifically, the theory suggests a slower-acting behavioural modification strain, not a reanimation strain, not something that kills and resurrects, but something that gradually alters the behaviour of living hosts over months. The reason this theory exists is the Whisperers, actually, and we'll get to that connection properly in a later section. But the seed of it is in those CDC scenes, the suggestion that Jenna knew more than he said, and that some of what he knew he chose to take with him. There's a genuinely fun theory, and I want to be clear that this one is in the fun rather than credible category, that the bicycle woman Rick Mercy kills in the very first minutes of the pilot is the American patient 0 for the wildfire virus. The connection to Fear the Walking Dead is the character of Gloria, who appears in the Fear pilot as the first walker we see in that show, in an abandoned church in Los Angeles. She's been theorized as a candidate for the American patient 0 based on her location, near a port city with international traffic, and her timing. She turns very early. The bicycle woman was never named in the main show. The locations are about 2,000 miles apart. The logistics are, charitably speaking, impossible. And yet, the theory exists. People have made spreadsheets. I respect the commitment. The Walking Dead, World Beyond established a fairly precise in-universe timeline. Day 1 is the initial outbreak at the French facility. Day 59 is when Rick Grimes wakes up from his coma in King County, Georgia. That's 59 days. And he survived those 59 days with a working intravenous drip in a hospital that had lost power, lost staff, and been overrun. The standard reading is that the hospital generators or emergency battery systems maintain the IV. The theory is that this isn't sufficient, that someone physically maintained that IV line for 59 days, because that's how long an IV bag actually lasts, and someone would have needed to change it. The CRM, by the timeline established in the spin-offs, was already operational and already watching survivor populations at this point. Rick's status as an exceptional individual, what the CRM would classify as an A, was detectable even in a comatose state. The theory is that they kept him alive specifically to see what he would become. This one is more of a biology observation than a traditional theory, but it's been discussed enough that it belongs here. And once I started thinking about it, I couldn't stop because it actually resolves something that otherwise makes no sense. By any realistic standard of decomposition, a walker that has been dead for 18 months to 2 years should not be able to move. Soft tissue deterioration, bone degradation, the absence of any metabolic process to maintain muscle function, none of these standard reanimation models account for walkers that are years old and still mobile. The theory is that the wildfire virus actively arrests certain decomposition processes in the tissue it inhabits. It's essentially preserving its host, keeping the biological machinery that allows locomotion intact, because a mobile host is a more effective transmission vector than a stationary pile of decomposing material. This would also explain the variance in walker speed and coordination. Older walkers are slower not because they're more decayed, but because the preservation is less complete in older reanimations, before the virus fully optimized its behavior in a given body, which is genuinely a more satisfying answer than the show just doesn't think about this too hard. The French lab origin story requires a containment failure that spread a pathogen from a single facility to effectively every country on Earth within a matter of months. That's not impossible for a highly contagious airborne disease, but it requires either an extremely fast transmission timeline or a secondary carrier mechanism. The theory that gets traction here is migratory birds, specifically the kind that travel in large numbers along established routes between continents. The Walking Dead's world is notably full of birds. Ravens appear throughout the series in ways that feel almost deliberate. Birds don't reanimate, or if they do, we've never seen it, which suggests the virus doesn't affect them, but they could still carry it asymptomatically, depositing it in water sources, soil, food supplies. This would also explain why isolated communities in remote locations were infected just as quickly as dense urban populations. Fear the Walking Dead seasons. 6 and 7 contain what might be the most significant piece of lore dropped in the entire franchise, outside of the world beyond post-credits scene. Alicia Clark survives a walker bite after amputation, then survives what appears to be a secondary, systemic infection that should have killed her within 48 hours. She doesn't just survive, she recovers. June Dory's in-universe explanation is prior radiation exposure from a radioactive walker, which may have weakened the infection enough for Alicia's natural immunity to manage it. But the broader theory the fandom has run with is that Alicia's situation proves partial immunity exists on a spectrum, that some people carry genetic or biological factors that allow them to resist or delay the infection, and that this variance has existed in the general population the whole time, which raises the question of how many of the main cast, particularly those who survived serious injuries and contact with walkers over years, might have had some degree of natural resistance without knowing it. The Looper analysis of the world beyond reveal makes a fairly convincing case for this. When the man in the French lab tells the returning scientist that "you started this, all the teams, and were responsible for all of this," his accusation implies an ongoing institutional relationship, not a historical one. 1. And Jenna, in Season 1, mentions contact with other facilities before all communication went dark. The theory is that the CDC and the French biomedical lab were in active correspondence, that Jenna knew at minimum the origin story of the virus he was studying, and that the classified data he deleted before destroying the building included everything he knew about where it came from. If true, this changes the meaning of his sacrifice slightly. He wasn't just a scientist at the end of his rope. He was possibly a man who had been carrying the knowledge of his institution's connection to the worst thing that had ever happened, and who chose to take that knowledge with him rather than let anyone else carry it. One of the small but persistent continuity questions in the show is why some people reanimate faster than others after death. The general answer from the production side has been dramatic necessity. People reanimate when the story needs them to. But the fan theory version is more interesting. The idea is that the virus exists in a dormant form at different concentrations depending on environment, higher in dense urban areas with lots of carrier activity, lower in rural areas or spaces that haven't seen a lot of walker presence. People who live in high concentration environments for extended periods have higher baseline virus loads when they die, which means faster reanimation. People in more isolated areas have lower loads, which means slower reanimation. This would explain not just the timing variance, but also some of the behavioural variance in newly turned walkers. Higher initial viral load, more aggressive, immediate post-turn behaviour. This is probably the darkest of the first 15, and also the one that feels most consistent with what the spin-offs eventually confirmed about the CRM's actual mission. Beale's plan, as revealed in The Ones Who Live, was never to find a cure and restore civilization. It was to reduce the global population to a sustainable level, essentially to accept the apocalypse as permanent and manage the surviving human population through controlled attrition. The theory is that this was always the plan, that the CRM's research into the virus was never genuinely aimed at a cure, but at a deeper understanding of the reanimation process that would allow them to control it more precisely as a population management tool. The cure as a concept, the thing that kept communities motivated, kept people cooperating with CRM extraction operations, kept A-types willingly walking into their labs, was a story. A very effective one. The kind of story that only requires a few true believers to be plausible, and the CRM had enough of those. Since we're on the topic of the virus itself, it makes sense to talk a little about what the virus actually does, about the creatures it produces and some of the weirder details of walker biology that the show never fully addressed. I find walkers genuinely fascinating is the thing, not as a horror device, but as a biology problem, because once you start looking at them that way, the show is full of small details that either make sense through a very specific theoretical lens or don't make sense at all, and nobody in the writer's room ever seemed particularly concerned about resolving them. Here are 12 of the more interesting ones. This one originated on Reddit some years ago from a user who'd been paying close attention to the behavioural patterns of walkers across the first few seasons, and it's one of those theories that once you see it, you can't unsee it. The observation is this: walkers that are outdoors and exposed to sunlight are consistently more active, moving around, searching, responding to stimuli, while walkers that end up in basements, locked rooms, windowless buildings, or other dark enclosed spaces are consistently near dormant until something brings them back to activity. The proposed explanation is that the virus's reanimation mechanism draws energy from solar radiation in some way, not unlike how certain organisms use photosynthesis, but in a far more primitive form. The dead tissue can't generate its own energy from consumed food because there's no functional digestive system operating. But if the viral cells have mutated in a way that allows them to convert light exposure into the electrochemical signals needed to maintain basic motor function, that would explain both the activity differential and the perpetual motion problem. How walkers keep moving without eating. It's not a perfect theory, but it's consistent with what the show actually shows you, which is more than you can say for most things. This one is less about biology and more about the specific way the virus interacts with whatever is left of neurological tissue. The observation, which gets made fairly often in discussions of the show's early seasons, is that walkers don't just move toward food sources or sounds, they also, demonstrably, move toward halukattai. The bicycle woman is moving toward Rick when he finds her. Some walker behaviour, particularly among certain variants, suggests a tendency to return to familiar environments: malls, houses, churches, workplaces, ACEs. The theory is that the virus, which has co-opted the brain's motor systems, has also retained some access to long-term spatial memory. Not conscious memory, not anything that constitutes identity, but the deep neurological encoding of physical spaces that are associated with strong emotion. The virus uses these pathways because they're the most durable ones, the ones that survive the longest as tissue degrades. So walkers return to the places their former selves loved most, not because they remember anything, but because that information is literally the last thing left in the tissue. The geography of walker movements in the show has a pattern that I don't think the writers always intended, but that's there regardless. Herds tend to follow river valleys, old highway routes, urban corridors. The theory is that this isn't purely coincidence, that walkers aggregate along the same topographic routes that human beings used when building infrastructure, because those routes were optimized for travel in the first place. The more interesting version of this theory is architectural. The roads and highways and bridges that human civilization built were designed to facilitate the easiest possible movement through landscape. A walker following those routes isn't consciously navigating. It's following the path of least resistance through an environment that was specifically designed to create exactly that path, which means human infrastructure is, in a quiet and unintentional way, a mechanism that amplifies the threat of walker herds. The very things built to make human movement easier make walker movement easier too. This is one of the harder theories to evaluate because it would require acoustic analysis of the show that nobody has ever done rigorously. The observation is that walker herds coordinate in ways that suggest more than just simple stimulus response to sound and movement. When a herd shifts direction, the shift propagates through the group faster than it would if each individual walker was independently responding to the same sound source. It looks sometimes like flocking behavior in birds, the kind of coordinated movement that requires real-time information sharing between individuals. The theory is that the virus enables some form of low-frequency communication between hosts, something in the range that human ears can't pick up, but that walkers can both produce and detect. This would explain herd cohesion without requiring any conscious coordination. It would also, actually, explain the whisperer's ability to move among herds. If the communication channel is something they learn to mimic, their camouflage is more sophisticated than just the smell of the skin. The generally accepted explanation for why older walkers are slower is muscle deterioration, the simple mechanical decline of tissue that's been dead for a long time. But the theory here focuses on the neurological side rather than the physical side. The idea is that as the nerve tissue in a reanimated body degrades, the signal transmission time from stimulus to motor response increases. A freshly turned walker receives a signal, processes it, and responds in something close to the time a living person would. A walker that's been dead for 2 years might receive the same signal, but the degraded nerve pathways mean the processing delay is measurably longer. Not slower muscles, slower communication between the virus-controlled brain and the body it's operating. This would mean that older walkers aren't just physically weaker, they're neurologically lagged in a way that a survivor who understood this could exploit tactically. This is one of the more poetic theories in the walker biology category, and I've always found it genuinely moving even though it's probably completely wrong. Michonne's 2 pet walkers from the very beginning of Season 3, her former boyfriend Mike and his friend Terry, were rendered docile by removing their arms and jaws. The standard explanation is straightforward. No arms, no ability to attack. No jaw, no ability to bite. And a docile walker drawing in a group doesn't attract attention from other walkers. But the theory adds another layer. The specific walkers Michonne chose were people she had loved, and the way she handled them, the care she took in maintaining them, the way she kept them functional rather than simply destroying them, suggests something beyond pragmatic calculation. The theory is that walkers retain some vestigial awareness of strong emotional bonds, not as memory, not as anything conscious, but as a kind of cellular recognition that causes the virus to behave differently around people it once loved. The virus in Mike's body knew Michonne on some level that even death hadn't erased. It's probably not true, but it's a beautiful idea, and the show seems to be reaching for something like it. This is one of those details that the show put in its very first episode and then never addressed, and yet it's been sitting there the whole time. The bicycle woman, the first walker Rick encounters in the pilot in the park, has been separated from her lower half. She can't move except to drag herself along the ground, and when Rick finds her, she's been there long enough to be significantly decomposed, but she's in a park near a hospital, and she's facing toward the hospital, and the theory is that she was a nurse or a medical worker, that she became infected at the hospital, or near it, that whatever happened to her lower body happened during the initial outbreak chaos, and that she has been dragging herself toward the building where she used to work ever since, for weeks, maybe months, not because she has any conscious goal, but because the muscle memory of her commute, the deep neurological encoding of the route she'd walked 1,000 times, was the last navigational information she had. Rick apologizes to her before he puts her down. He says sorry, and whether or not the theory is true, that apology lands differently once you think about where she might have been going. The exterior of the CDC building in Season 1 shows something that gets very little screen time. Rows of bodies, hundreds of them, wrapped and laid out in organised lines, not piled, not abandoned, arranged. Someone, at some point, made the effort to wrap the dead and lay them out properly. The theory is that this was Jenner, that in the weeks or months between losing his colleagues, including his wife, TS-19, and the arrival of Rick's group, he spent part of his time doing this, burying people he couldn't save, going through the motions of a ritual that had no practical purpose in a world that was ending, because he couldn't think of anything more important to do. And then he came back inside and kept working and waited for the generators to run out. It's never addressed in the show. It may not have been intentional. But as a character detail for Jenner, a man who was clearly in profound grief and clearly still trying to do the right thing, it's one of the most quietly devastating things in the first seas. The season-to-season deterioration of walkers is a background detail. The show never made central, but always implied. Older walkers are more decayed, and many fans interpret this to mean that eventually the walker threat will diminish, as the reanimated dead simply fall apart, except that cold water significantly slows decomposition. And the Walking Dead universe has a lot of flooded areas, submerged vehicles, and waterlogged environments. The theory is that walkers who ended up in cool water are significantly more preserved than the ones who've been walking through Georgia sun for 3 years, and that at some point in the franchise's future, they become the more dangerous threat. Not because they're smarter or faster, but because they're structurally more intact, more capable of sustained movement, more dangerous in physical confrontation. A future season exploring flooded areas or recovering submerged settlements would have had to deal with this, and it's interesting that the show never went there. This one requires a bit of background. The Walking Dead wiki documents a Woodbury research facility, an operation the governor ran alongside his brutal community management, in which walkers were studied, tested, and subjected to attempts at behavioural modification. It's not heavily featured in the show, but it's there. The theory is that the governor, for all his obvious monstrousness, had a more sophisticated understanding of walker behaviour than Rick's group ever developed. His arena fights were partly entertainment and partly observation, controlled experiments in walker behaviour under stress conditions, with a live audience providing data on how walkers respond to crowds, noise, and emotional stimuli. The cruelty and the research weren't separate things, they were the same thing. And the governor almost certainly had insights that died with him, things about the walkers that nobody else in the show's universe ever independently discovered. This is a callback to a point raised in older fan theory discussions, the question of why walkers sometimes move together in ways that look like schooling fish, shifting direction without apparent cause, moving in coordinated arcs across open terrain. The standard dismissal is that it's a production artifact, not intentional story content. But if you accept the low-frequency communication theory from earlier, that the virus enables some form of signal between hosts, then the schooling behaviour has a natural explanation. It's the same mechanism as birds flocking or fish schooling, a rapid cascade of information through a connected network where one node's change in state is transmitted to adjacent nodes almost simultaneously. The walkers aren't thinking, but they are in a very limited sense communicating. The burning walkers in Daryl Dixon generated a lot of discussion about whether France had a fundamentally different virus than America, and the franchise hasn't fully committed to an answer. But the most internally consistent theory is that it's the same virus, differently evolved. France was ground zero. The virus has been replicating and adapting in French hosts for longer than anywhere else. The population density of a European urban environment provides more replication opportunities per unit of time than rural Georgia does. And the theory that viruses evolve toward greater transmissibility and toward behaviors that better serve their spread. In walkers, this could mean more aggressive tissue preservation, more active interaction with new hosts, more corrosive contact mechanics that force surrounding living humans into defensive actions that increase exposure probability. The French variants aren't a different problem. They're a preview of what the American walkers might become. Now, since we've spent a while on the virus and on walkers, let's talk about the man who spent 11 seasons dealing with both of them. One of the things I find most interesting about Rick Grimes as a character is how carefully the show constructed his internal life alongside his external one. He's not just a guy making decisions in an apocalypse. He's a guy carrying a specific psychological history through an apocalypse, and that history shows up in details that the show sometimes addresses directly, and sometimes just leaves sitting there. Here are the theories I find most compelling about him. Season 3, Rick. The Rick who spends several episodes picking up a phone and talking to dead people, who hallucinates Laurie, who is clearly in the middle of something that looks like a psychotic break, is generally read as a man undone by grief. His wife died. He's in shock. He's dissociating. That's the sympathetic reading, and it's not wrong. But the theory that goes a bit further suggests that Rick's capacity for this kind of dissociation didn't begin with Laurie's death. His ability to split his internal experience from his external reality to function normally on the surface while processing something catastrophic underneath is actually visible earlier. The way he compartmentalized the news of his marriage's trouble before the apocalypse, the speed with which he rebuilt a functional exterior after the coma, the telephone hallucinations being a relatively organized psychological response to an overwhelmingly disorganized situation. The theory is that Rick had a pre-existing vulnerability toward dissociation that the apocalypse didn't create. It just finally found material large enough to work with. We touched on this in the virus section, but it's worth expanding here in the context of Rick as a character. The CRM's A and B classification system, which we know was operational by the time Jadis encountered them, implies an infrastructure for identifying and evaluating exceptional individuals. The system doesn't work unless you have people actively looking, people cataloguing. The theory is that the CRM had operatives in or around King County General in the first weeks of the outbreak, doing exactly this, identifying survivors with exceptional potential, and in at least one case, maintaining life support to preserve someone they'd already identified as worth preserving. This doesn't require the CRM to be specifically benevolent toward Rick. It requires them to be organized enough and far-sighted enough to recognize that the people who would shape what came next were worth keeping alive in the early chaos, even at cost. This is one of those theories that doesn't seem like a theory because it's so close to the surface of the text, but it's worth saying explicitly. Rick kept wearing that uniform long past the point where it made any practical sense. It's visually conspicuous in a world where not drawing attention is advantageous. It marks him as affiliated with an institution that no longer exists. It's additional material to maintain, and yet he keeps wearing it. The theory is that Rick understood, perhaps not consciously at first, but increasingly deliberately, that authority in a collapsed social order requires symbols. People don't follow a man with a gun. There are plenty of men with guns. People follow something that represents a system they remember, a framework they've internalized, a promise of order. The uniform was that promise, walking around in Georgia. Without it, he was just another scared person who happened to be right a lot of the time. Late season 2, after Herschel's farm, Rick makes a speech that functionally dissolves whatever collaborative decision-making the group had been operating under and establishes himself as sole authority. This isn't a democracy anymore. It's a speech that the show clearly frames as a turning point, as the moment Rick's leadership becomes something darker and more complicated. The character theory here is that Rick felt this as he said it, that he wasn't rationalizing or self-deceiving. He knew it was a corruption of something, and he said it anyway because the alternative felt more dangerous. And that awareness of the corruption, carried quietly throughout the middle seasons, is what makes him different from the governor. The governor genuinely believed his methods were correct. Rick, the theory argues, never stopped knowing that some of his methods were wrong. He just decided the alternatives were worse. That tension is the most interesting thing in his character. The Season 8 finale is one of the most divisive moments in the show's history. Rick looking at the flowering tree, sparing Negan, Maggie's understandable fury. Most readings present it as an in-the-moment decision, a sudden choice driven by the vision of the tree and the memory of Carl's dying wish. But there's a theory, built on small moments across Season 8, that Rick had already worked this out well before the final battle. His conversations with Sue Deek about Carl, the way he approached negotiations with the Savior's lieutenants, even during active combat, more exploratory than purely tactical, as though he was always trying to understand the system, rather than just destroy the node at the top. The theory is that Rick had already decided, sometime in the middle of Season 8, that killing Negan would trigger a war with the Saviors that Alexandria couldn't survive, and that a post-Negan integration, painful and slow and deeply unpopular, was the only viable path to something lasting. Andrew Lincoln is English. His Georgia accent in the early seasons is generally good, convincing enough that most American audiences didn't notice the work behind it. But across the seasons, particularly in the later ones, the accent loosens. It becomes something slightly different, more southern or sometimes just less precise. The theory is that this wasn't purely Lincoln losing control of the performance, that it was a deliberate choice, possibly discussed with the creative team, to show a man becoming more deeply embedded in his own survival culture. The accent of the person he was performing, the Georgia sheriff, the symbol of old world authority, gradually giving way to the accent of the person he was actually becoming. It's a small detail, but if it was intentional, it's exactly the kind of small detail that distinguishes good character work from great character work. The A and B classification gets its clearest explanation from Jadis in the World Beyond Season 2 finale. A-types are exceptional individuals, leaders, people who build systems and break the ones that don't. Wokafer says B-types are followers, people who maintain existing structures, like Urays. The CRM wants B-types for its own institution because B-types are manageable. A-types, in the CRM's experience, are too autonomous to employ safely, so they study them instead. Rick Grimes is the most A-type person the franchise has produced. He built the prison community from nothing. He rebuilt Alexandria. He organized the coalition that defeated the Saviors. He then tried to build a reconciliation framework in the aftermath. He did all of this without institutional backing, without inherited authority, with nothing but the persuasive force of his own conviction. The CRM's interest in him isn't just about his abilities, it's about the fact that a person like Rick, operating independently, is the single greatest threat to any institution built on controlling the behavior of large populations. Every time Morgan reappears in the show, he reflects a version of Rick that could have existed under different circumstances. It's one of the most carefully constructed parallel relationships in the series. Season 1, Morgan can't kill the thing he loves. Rick at this point still has Laurie and Carl. The unbearable choice hasn't arrived yet. Season 3, Morgan has dissolved into grief and violence, lost his son, lost his mind. Rick in the same season is losing his grip on reality and making decisions that are increasingly indistinguishable from the governor's. Season 5 and 6. Morgan has found discipline, a philosophy, a framework for existing that doesn't require him to become the worst version of himself. Rick, at this point, is still figuring out whether that version of peace is available to him at all. Morgan isn't Rick's foil exactly. He's more like a series of time-delayed photographs. Here's what you were, here's what you might become, here's what you could still. The show uses him to map Rick's interior arc against an external reference point. And the fact that they're just 4 of the surviving members of the original cast when Morgan leaves the main show feels almost mathematically correct. The Ones Who Live ends with Rick and Michonne. While the CRM is reformed, at least in the sense that its worst elements have been exposed. They're going home. And a lot of viewers read this as a resolution, as the end of Rick's story. The theory that persists is that it isn't, that the story arc begun in days gone by in that hospital hallway, in a man waking up to a world that had ended, has one remaining beat, death. Not dramatic death, not a sacrifice, not a war casualty. The quieter, more definitive kind. A man who fought long enough to see his family safe, who built enough of what he was trying to build, who finally laid down the weight. The theory is that the franchise always intended to give Rick Grimes a death scene, and that The Ones Who Live was the penultimate chapter rather than the final one. The gurney blocking Rick's door in the pilot. It's there in the first moments of the show, propped against the entrance to his room, keeping the door from opening inward. Someone placed it there. The show never addresses this. In the chaos of a hospital overrun in the first days of the outbreak, someone took the time to barricade a comatose patient's room from the outside. The theory is that a hospital worker, a nurse, an orderly, someone who was doing their job when everything fell apart, blocked that door to protect a patient they couldn't save and couldn't stay with. It wasn't a lock. It wasn't proper barricade. It was someone doing the last small thing available to them before they ran. And it's the reason Rick Grimes survived long enough to become Rick Grimes. The show never names that person, but they're the first hero of the story. The Civic Republic military is probably the most interesting institutional villain the franchise has produced. And it's interesting specifically because it isn't a villain in any simple sense. It's an organization with a coherent philosophy, substantial resources, a functional long-term plan, and methods that are genuinely unconscionable. It's a government, essentially, which is the most frightening thing it could be. The CRM's insignia, 3 interlocking circles or rings, has generated a lot of interpretive discussion. The official in-universe explanation never quite arrives. But the most popular theory is that each circle represents a major population centre that the CRM has either absorbed or eliminated in the process of consolidating its resource base and establishing its territory. The known CRM attacks on Omaha and Campus Colony are 2. The third circle is debated. Portland, the hilltop. One of the communities we never saw. The theory implies that the logo is a progress marker of a kind, that whoever designed it was either darkly ironic or genuinely proud, and that the organization it represents defines itself by the communities it has consumed rather than the one it's trying to protect. This is the one that requires pausing and zooming and a certain willingness to see what you want to see. In the first episode of the first season, Rick rides a horse into Atlanta through streets full of abandoned military vehicles. The city has been lost. And in a reflection on a building's glass facade, there appears to be, very briefly, very ambiguously, a helicopter. The theory is that this helicopter is a CRM craft, and that it was intentionally placed there either as foreshadowing or as retroactive canon when the spin-offs developed the CRM concept. The counter-argument is that the show had no concept of the CRM in 2010 when this was filmed, and that the helicopter is simply the military helicopter established as part of the Atlanta storyline. Both things can be true, actually. The CRM helicopter reading works whether it was planned from the beginning or whether it was a piece of imagery that the franchise later decided to claim. The show running that long generates those kinds of convergences. One of the things that makes the CRM a more interesting villain than the governor or even the whisperers is the institutional separation between the military and the civilian population it ostensibly serves. The civic republic, the city itself, the 200,000 people living inside it, appears to function as a genuine, if stratified, society. People have jobs, children go to school, there's art, culture, commerce. The theory is that the civilian government of the civic republic was never fully informed about the CRM's operational methods. Not just kept in the dark about specific atrocities, fundamentally separated from the military's chain of command in a way that allowed the CRM to operate as a completely autonomous entity using civilian resources. The council that Rick and Michonne ultimately appeal to in The Ones Who Live seems genuinely shocked by what they're told. The theory is that their shock is real, that the CRM had been functioning for years as a separate state within the state, and the civilians it claimed to protect had no more understanding of its actual activities than a medieval peasant had of the wars their lord was fighting. Thomas Robert Malthus was an 18th century economist whose most famous argument was essentially that human population growth will always outpace resource production, and that the natural corrective mechanisms, famine, disease, war, are the inevitable result of this imbalance. It's a grim framework that has been used to justify a great deal of actual harm over the centuries. Beale's plan in The Ones Who Live is Malthusian in its bones. Global population has been catastrophically reduced. Remaining resources are insufficient to support a return to pre-outbreak civilization. Therefore, a deliberate and managed further reduction is the rational response. The theory is that the writers built Beale as a character who had specifically read Malthus or something like him, and arrived at the Walker Dead scenario as the logical endpoint of that thinking, which would make Beale not a madman, but a very educated, very rational person who had followed a real philosophical tradition to a conclusion that most real philosophers were careful never to draw. Anne Jadis is often read as an unpredictable, inconsistent character, the bizarre junkyard queen who speaks in clipped non-grammar, the woman who keeps switching sides, the opportunist who trades Rick Grimes for CRM entry. But the theory is that she's actually one of the most internally consistent characters in the show, and that the apparent inconsistencies resolve once you understand her core value: information. Jadis Anne has always been a person who understood that in a world where everything has collapsed, the only real currency is what you know and who you know it about. The junkyard community was an information-gathering operation as much as a survival community. She knew about multiple groups, maintained relationships with all of them, and sold that knowledge when she needed to. Her transition to the CRM was the ultimate expression of this value. The CRM is the most information-rich institution in the post-apocalyptic world, and joining it was the most rational possible move for a person who believed that knowledge was survival. She didn't betray Rick. She calculated the cost and made the trade she'd decided she was willing to make. She'd been making trades her whole life. The Declaration of Independence was signed in Philadelphia. The Constitutional Convention was held in Philadelphia. The city holds a specific symbolic weight in American political history. It's where the American experiment in democratic governance began. The theory is that whoever chose Philadelphia as the location for the Civic Republic's hidden city was making a deliberate historical statement. Whether ironic or sincere, the choice puts the CRM in the birthplace of American democracy, building something that is, in many ways, democracy's precise inversion. A civilization maintained through secrecy, controlled population, and military authority. The founding of America was a flawed but genuine attempt to build something new. The Civic Republic is a flawed and disingenuous attempt to rebuild something old. That they're in the same city feels like the writers thinking carefully about geography. The A and B system, which Theory 34 covered in full, implies organizational infrastructure that doesn't form overnight. For the CRM to be operating as it does in World Beyond, set roughly 9 to 10 years post-outbreak, it would have needed to begin organizing within the first year, possibly within the first months. The theory is that the CRM had a precursor organization that predated the outbreak, a government continuity program, something designed to activate in exactly this kind of civilizational emergency, and that the classification system was adapted from pre-existing emergency management protocols that evaluated individuals for their usefulness in reconstruction efforts. The CRM didn't invent a taxonomy for sorting humans. It inherited one and found a more efficient way to act on it, which, if true, means that someone who worked in emergency management before the apocalypse made a decision very early on that would shape the entire franchise's back half, and that person has never appeared on screen. Following from the AB framework, the specific thing I keep coming back to is what an institution looks like after years of filtering out its most questioning members. If B types are defined by their tendency to maintain existing systems rather than challenge them, and the CRM has been routing A types away from itself for years, then what you end up with is an organization staffed almost entirely by people who will not meaningfully push back against its methods. No internal resistance, no dissent with any real traction. The people with the most institutional loyalty are precisely the people least likely to notice when the institution crosses a line that should stop it. The theory is that the CRM's atrocities, the gas attacks, the lab experiments, Beale's population plan, weren't the results of exceptional evil at the top. They were the predictable output of an institution that had systematically removed everyone who might have said no, which is a more frightening argument than any individual villain because it doesn't require a monster at the centre. It just requires a very effective HR policy applied consistently over a decade. The CRM's use of chlorine gas to destroy Omaha and Campus Colony, communities that contain thousands of people, is framed in World Beyond as a strategic decision to eliminate populations that couldn't be integrated and that represented security risks. But the theory is that the framing itself is cover for something more specific. The communities that were destroyed were not, by the evidence available, active threats to the CRM. They were large survivor populations with their own governance and their own resource bases. What they were, from a research perspective, was a set of human subjects who had been surviving in documented conditions for a known period of time. Eliminating them with a specific agent in a controlled way, and then studying the aftermath, the environmental contamination, the biological effects, the rate of reanimation in a post-gas environment, would generate data that a purely strategic strike wouldn't. The theory is that Beale's research program included human experimentation at a scale that the show was careful never to show directly. Every authoritarian system in history has contained the seeds of its own collapse, and those seeds are always the same. The institution requires secrecy to function, and secrecy requires an expanding infrastructure of people who know the secrets and are motivated to keep them. And eventually, the number of people who know is too large, and the motivation to keep silent is no longer sufficient. This is true of the Stasi, of the Soviet internal security apparatus, of every large-scale secret program that has ever been run by a government. Rick and Michonne, at the end of The Ones Who Live, have triggered this process by revealing the CRM's atrocities to the council. The theory is that this is sufficient, not immediately, not cleanly, but irreversibly. The Civic Republic is now a population that knows things about the organisation that has been protecting and controlling it, and institutions that are known cannot function the way institutions that are secret can. The CRM ends not with a military defeat, but with the steady withdrawal of the consent it was never quite honest enough to ask for. This one is largely speculative and probably unprovable in the current state of the franchise. But the specific interest the CRM takes in Rick the fact that Jadis somehow knew to watch him, to evaluate him, to lie about his classification to protect him, implies a connection that goes deeper than organizational procedure. The theory is that somewhere in the CRM's founding membership or leadership structure is someone who knew Rick Grimes. Not knew of him, knew him. Someone from King County, or from his time in the Atlanta camp, or from the early days of the prison. Someone who understood what Rick was capable of and built a classification system specifically designed to both value and contain people like him. This would explain the almost personal quality of the CRM's interest in Rick specifically, as opposed to the many other exceptional survivors the franchise has produced. Now, talking a bit about Daryl Dixon, because his theories are their own particular category. There's something fundamentally interesting about theorizing around Daryl Dixon, which is that he has no comic book counterpart. Every character decision for him was made without a template, without a storyline to adapt, without the constraint of source material. The writers had complete freedom with him, and the theory community has always seemed to sense this. There's a different quality to Daryl theories than to theories about characters who existed first on paper. Bow ammunition is, in practical terms, one of the most logistically demanding weapon systems you could choose in an apocalypse. Arrows break, they stick in things. Retrieving them from a reanimated corpse is exactly as unpleasant as it sounds. And yet Daryl Dixon, across 11 seasons, is functionally never out of arrows at a meaningful dramatic moment. The theory, and this is one of the theories that sits firmly in the production decision, reader's character information category, is that this was deliberate. That early in the development of Daryl as a character, someone decided that his competence was the thing that defined him, and that showing him run out of arrows would introduce a kind of vulnerability that would shift his character register in ways the show didn't want. He was always the one who could be relied upon. Reliable people don't run out of ammunition in the middle of a crisis, so he didn't. This is one of those theories that feels almost controversial to say out loud, because Carol and Daryl is such a central relationship for so much of the show, and Rick and Daryl is such an obvious emotional anchor. But the Beth theory has real support in the text. Before Beth, Daryl's relationships, even his relationship with Rick, are built around utility and mutual survival. He's valuable because he can track and hunt and fight. He's included because he's useful. What Beth does in the season 4 episodes where they're alone together after the prison falls is something different. She sees his pain as something worth attending to, not as something to work around or to manage, but as something real that deserves acknowledgement. She pushes him to feel things he's been suppressing since childhood. The fire they build in the abandoned shack is one of the show's most cathartic small moments, and it's cathartic specifically because it's the first time Daryl has been given permission to grieve without also being expected to function. Carol loves Daryl, and that love is real and important, but Beth saw him first. The season 4 episode where Daryl and Beth break into and eventually burn down a moonshiner's cabin is mostly remembered for the emotional climax of Daryl's grief, and that's fair. It's a very good sequence, but the cabin itself is interesting, and the person who lived there is interesting. The theory is that this was a genuine survivalist who had been preparing for exactly this kind of scenario. Someone with stored supplies, a defensible location, a functional still, and apparently the wisdom to stay out of any community or group. The evidence in the cabin suggests someone was living there successfully for some time after the outbreak began. They're not there when Daryl and Beth arrive, so we don't know what happened to them. The theory is that they survived perfectly well, in isolation, probably better than anyone in Rick's group, and simply never intersected with the show's narrative. An entire viable survival strategy, briefly glimpsed and never followed up on. This one requires accepting a degree of CRM operational sophistication that the show hasn't fully confirmed, but that the spin-offs strongly imply. The theory is that Daryl's arrival in France, washed up on a French shore alone, was not accidental. That the CRM, which had been aware of Daryl Dixon as one of the most capable surviving individuals in their operational theatre, needed an A-type in France for specific reasons. Either because the research in France had reached a point where a field operative was required, or because the power of the living organisation represented a threat the CRM wanted assessed, or because someone in the CRM wanted to know whether the French variants could be survived by someone with Daryl's capabilities. Daryl didn't stumble into France. He was redirected there. And the question the theory leaves open is whether anyone in the CRM cared whether he came back. This is less a theory about what the show will do, and more a theory about what it should do, which is a slightly different category. But it's worth including because it represents a significant strand of fan thinking. The argument is that the Daryl Dixon spin-off has developed a version of the character, quieter, more contemplative, capable of relationships built on something other than shared violence, that is incompatible with the war-based narratives the main story has always relied on. Returning Daryl to a context where his primary function is tactical would undermine what the spin-off built. The show's most interesting argument for Daryl, the theory says, is that he found a way to exist that isn't defined by what he can destroy. Bringing him back into destroying contexts erases that. Merle Dixon spends most of his time in the show being genuinely difficult to like. He's violent, he's bigoted, he's unreliable, he's actively dangerous to the Grand then. In Season 3, he drives to the governor's meeting site alone, draws out as many Woodbury soldiers as he can, and is eventually captured and killed, buying the group time they needed, protecting his brother and the people his brother loves, dying in the most characteristically Merle way possible. Not quietly, not gracefully, making the governor do it himself face to face, ace. The theory is that the show wanted you to feel this specific thing, that redemption doesn't require a personality transplant, that a person can be genuinely bad in many of the ways Merle was bad and still make a choice. At the end, that means something. Not that the choice cancels the badness, just that it's real. Merle didn't become a good person. He made a good decision, for his own reasons, with his own style, and it cost him everything. The show treats this as sufficient. I think it's right to do so. Daryl Dixon, a man who has lost more people than most characters in television history, acquires a dog in the later seasons and names it Dog. Just Dog. Not a person's name, not a memorial name, not anything with emotional weight attached to it. The theory is that this is completely intentional characterization. Daryl has learned, through Carol and Beth and Glenn and Herschel and everyone else, that naming things after people, or giving names that carry the weight of people, makes losing them unbearable in a specific way. A dog named Dog is still a companion, still something to care for, but it's protected against the specific grief of a name. It's the most pragmatic emotional decision Daryl Dixon has ever made, and it's the kind of detail that either you notice or you don't. The vest Daryl wears, the cut with the angel wings on the back, was found in Merle's drug stash in Season 1 and has been on Daryl's back for the entire run of the main series. The wings are dark, slightly moth-eaten, more fallen than triumphant. The costuming theory, which has been discussed since at least Season 2, is that this was a deliberate choice, that the production design team, early on, decided that Daryl Dixon was going to be a dark angel figure, the character who bridges the human and the monstrous, who can move through the worst of the world without being consumed by it. The angel wings as symbol of protection, the darkness of the wings as acknowledgement of what that protection costs. It's the kind of visual shorthand that great costume design does quietly, and the fact that the vest has survived 11 seasons and multiple wardrobe updates suggests it was protected as a piece of intentional characterization. Hypervigilance is the clinical term for a state of extreme environmental awareness and sensitivity to potential threats that is a well-documented symptom of post-traumatic stress. People who grew up in abusive or unpredictable environments develop it as a survival mechanism, the ability to read minute changes in a room, to anticipate threats before they materialize, to track movement and sound and behavioral cues with a precision that most people don't develop. The theory is that what the show presents as Daryl's exceptional tracking and hunting skill is at its root a trauma response. He learned to read his environment that precisely because he grew up in a household where failing to do so had consequences. The apocalypse didn't give Daryl Dixon his most valuable skill. An abusive childhood did. And the show, which handles Daryl's backstory with more restraint than almost any other character's backstory, lets this sit mostly unspoken, which feels correct. I want to spend a little time on Carol, because I think she has the most complete character arc in the show, and it consistently gets less analytical attention than it deserves. Probably because she doesn't have a dramatic death. Probably because she's not Rick. But if you trace what Carol does from the moment we meet her to the moment she goes to France, it's remarkable. The conventional reading of Carol's arc is transformation. Quiet, abused housewife becomes ruthless pragmatist through the demands of the apocalypse. And it's not wrong exactly. But the theory that refines this is that the pragmatism was never absent. It was present in Carol from the beginning. The practical intelligence, the clear-eyed assessment of what situations require, the willingness to do what needs doing, regardless of how it's received. Ed didn't create a compliant woman, he suppressed a capable one. The apocalypse didn't change Carol, it removed the external constraint that had been holding her back. And that's a subtly different argument. It shifts the moral weight slightly, suggests that the qualities that make Carol formidable in the apocalypse were always present, and that the tragedy of her earlier life wasn't the absence of those qualities, but their systematic suppression. Season 4's Flute arc is sometimes read as a departure for Carol. The moment she goes too far, acts unilaterally, crosses a line that Rick can't follow her across. The impulsive reading has her acting in a moment of panicked calculation, making a snap decision to prevent the flu from spreading. The theory is that this reading is wrong, that Carol had been building the framework for exactly this kind of decision since Woodbury, since witnessing what happens when groups fail to contain threats because moral squeamishness prevents necessary action. That by season 4, she had a fully formed ethical system that justified preemptive lethal action to protect the group, and the flu gave her the specific opportunity to apply it. This wasn't impulse, it was policy. And the reason Rick banishes her isn't that she acted without thinking, it's that she acted with very clear thinking that led somewhere he couldn't follow. Carol's performance for the Alexandrians in season 5, the cardigan, the casseroles, the cookies, the bright, slightly vacant smile of a woman with very small concerns, is one of the show's funniest and most technically impressive pieces of characterization. It's completely transparent to the audience and completely opaque to the Alexandrians. The theory is obvious once you name it. The cookies were a calculated political tool. Carol understood that Alexandrians were soft people who were managed by social currency, and she needed to accumulate enough social credit to operate safely inside a community that might otherwise see her as a threat. The cookies weren't kindness, they were investment, and the show presents this as both hilarious and brilliant rather than unsettling, which is the correct evaluation. It is brilliant. The best manipulation is always indistinguishable from generosity. Not Herschel, not Glenn, not Carl, Sophia, in the barn at the end of season 2. This is the theory I find myself returning to more than almost any other one about the show. Because what happens in that barn is not just a significant death, it's the death that defines everything Carol does from that moment forward. Sophia is who Carol was before she learned to protect herself. A gentle person in a brutal situation, waiting for someone to come and save her, not equipped with the internal architecture to save herself. Finding Sophia in the barn and having to witness Rick put her down while Carol watches, is the moment Carol closes the door on that version of herself permanently. Every ruthless decision Carol makes after the barn is a specific answer to the barn. If I had been harder, would Sophia have survived? If I had taught her better, trained her better, prepared her for a world that doesn't give you time to be gentle, would she still be here? The answer the show gives is probably not, but Carol's answer is to ensure that no one she loves will be in that barn again, whatever it costs. The multiple moments across the series where Carol attempts to remove herself from the group, leaving Alexandria in Season 6, the periods of withdrawal and isolation, are usually framed as PTSD, as a survivor who can't handle connection because she's lost too much. But the theory is more specific than that. Carol doesn't leave because connection hurts. She leaves because she knows what she's capable of to protect the people she loves. And she's afraid of doing those things to the wrong people, or without sufficient justification, or in a moment of paranoia rather than necessity. She's not protecting herself from grief. She's protecting the people she loves from herself. The risk assessment she's running is not, if I stay, I'll be hurt. It's if I stay and I lose someone again, I don't know what I'll do, and I don't want to find out. This one is partially a fan response to years of shipping discourse, but it's also a genuine structural theory about why the Carol-Daryl dynamic is the show's most durable relationship. The argument is that the show recognized early, possibly very early, possibly in the first season, that Carol and Daryl's dynamic was built on something more specific and more interesting than romantic compatibility. They are two people who survived different forms of violence and found each other on the other side of that survival. And what they recognize in each other is not attraction, but the particular quality of someone who knows what it costs. Making them a couple would have required them to develop a language of intimacy, a forward-facing relationship with expectations and futures. What they actually have is something rarer, a relationship that requires no performance, no maintenance, no explanation. They just know. Romantic love would have been less than what they already have. The show was right not to go there. This one is in the category of theories that would require a very detailed comparison of shooting scenes across the seasons to properly evaluate, but it's been assembled with some care by fans who pay attention to this kind of thing. Carol's marksmanship in Seasons 3 and 4 is presented as exceptional. The Season 4 Turmichnes escape particularly. By the later seasons, it's less reliably portrayed as exceptional, and there are moments where her aim is demonstrably less precise than it once was. The theory is that this is unaddressed physical aging, that Carol's eyesight has been deteriorating since at least Season 6, and that nobody in the writer's room felt it was worth a storyline, so it just exists in the production as an unacknowledged detail, which is either a failure of attention or, more generously, a realistic acknowledgement that people in the apocalypse age without anyone commenting on it. The kingdom's king Ezekiel is, by his own admission, a Karaka community theatre actor who decided that in a world that had gone mad, a little theatre might be what kept people going. Owing. He performs the king because the king is what people needed, and Carol, when she arrives at the kingdom, performs the harmless, slightly bewildered housewife because that's what gets her past defenses fastest. And then they recognize each other. Two performers, immediately understanding what the other is doing, finding the specific relief of not having to maintain the performance in private. The theory is that this shared understanding of performance and the specific vulnerability of dropping it in someone's presence is the foundation of why their relationship works. They weren't falling in love with each other's characters. They were falling in love with the people behind the characters, which they could see precisely because they knew how performance worked. Everything in Carol's arc on the main show, every decision, every departure, every return, is defined in relation to other people. Her development as a survivor is articulated through the people she protects. Sophia, the group, Rick's children, the kingdom, Ezekiel. Even her departures are defined by the people she's leaving to keep them safe. The Book of Carol, the Daryl Dixon. Season 2 subtitle is the first time Carol's story is about Carol. About what she is when there's no one specific to protect, no community to defend, no relationship structuring her choices. The theory is that the show always owed her this and was slow to deliver it, and that France is where the debt gets paid. Who is Carol Pelletier when she's not being defined by her relationship to someone else's survival? The theory is that the show thinks the answer is interesting enough to build a whole arc around. Shane Walsh is one of those characters the show was very careful to make unlikable enough that you wouldn't sit with the more uncomfortable parts of his worldview for too long. He makes it easy to dismiss him. And yet the Shane was right discourse has been running for over a decade now, which suggests the show wasn't quite careful enough. Shane Walsh in Season 1 has a full head of hair. Shane Walsh in Season 2 becomes progressively balder, reaching the fully shaved look after the killing of Otis, the moment many viewers identify as the point of no return for his character. The production confirmed that this was intentional. The physical change tracked the internal one. The theory is about why this particular visual choice works so well. Shane removing his hair is an act of erasure of the person he was before, the person who would have been horrified by what he did in that field. The shaved head doesn't make him look more dangerous, exactly. It makes him look like someone in the process of becoming someone new, someone who has decided that the old face no longer applies. This is the one that once you see it, recontextualizes the entire first season. Shane spent 6 weeks after the outbreak believing his best friend was dead. He grieved Rick. He protected Rick's family, and in doing so, built a life and an identity around their survival. He didn't replace Rick. He became what Rick had been, because someone had to be it, and Rick wasn't there. And then Rick came back. Not as a ghost, not as a memory, but as a living person with a prior claim on everything Shane had organised his new life around. The theory is that Rick's return wasn't experienced by Shane as a miracle. It was experienced as a structural collapse. 6 weeks of grief and adaptation invalidated. The Shane who greets Rick is already the person who's been through this loss and rebuilt. Rick's survival forced him to unrebuild. The Shane was right argument has limits, and the theory here is about where those limits fall. Shane's philosophy, efficiency over mercy, present survival over future ethics, the group over the individual, is genuinely well suited for the first 6 months to a year of an apocalypse. In that period, every day is a resource problem, and every stranger is a potential threat, and sentiment is genuinely dangerous. Shane's approach minimises casualties in exactly that context. But the second phase, the phase that begins when basic survival is secured, and the question becomes what kind of society you're trying to build, is the phase Shane's philosophy can't address. You can't build anything lasting on pure efficiency. You can't maintain community through pure threat assessment. Shane's toolkit was built for one environment and constitutionally unsuited to the next one. He was right for the wrong era, and the tragedy is that he could see the era changing and couldn't change with it. Shane leaving Otis to be devoured in order to escape with the medical supplies Carl needed is one of the show's most discussed moral events. The arguments about whether the action itself was defensible have been going back and forth for years. The theory that cuts through this debate focuses not on the action, but on Shane's internal experience during it. The show gives us Shane's face in that field, and what it shows is not anguish, not the tortured expression of someone doing something they know is wrong for reasons they've accepted. What it shows is something closer to relief. The theory is that the Otis killing was Shane's discovery that he could perform and act like this and feel okay afterward. That the absence of unbearable guilt was more disturbing, in narrative terms, than the act itself. What made Shane dangerous wasn't that he killed Otis. It was that he was fine. Rick represents civilization's cost, mercy, due process, institutional faith, the willingness to spend resources on outcomes that aren't immediately practical. Shane represents civilization's absence, efficiency, violence, short-term optimization, the reduction of every moral question to a survival calculation. The show's argument, most clearly made in the moment Rick kills Shane in the field, is that civilization requires the cost. That a community built on Shane's principles isn't a civilization at all. It's just a differently organized version of the chaos outside the fence. But the show is honest enough, across 2 full seasons, to let Shane be right about enough specific things that Rick's eventual victory doesn't feel like a simple moral triumph. It feels like a choice, an expensive one. This is the comic's confirmed reading, and it's worth including because a significant portion of the show's audience has never encountered it. In the comics, Shane's confrontation with Rick is more explicitly suicidal. He knows he can't win, he knows he can't go back, and the most useful thing left for him to do is force Rick to make the kill and become someone capable of surviving what comes next. The theory holds in the show's version too. Shane doesn't ambush Rick efficiently. He engineers a confrontation that gives Rick every opportunity to read the threat and respond. He practically telegraphs the moment. The theory is that somewhere underneath the rage and the jealousy and the grief, Shane knew that the group needed Rick more than it needed him, and that Rick needed to have made this kind of decision before he could lead properly. It's possibly the most generous reading of Shane Walsh available. Laurie Grimes is one of the show's least popular characters, and much of the fan frustration with her has been laid at the feet of inconsistent writing, which in fairness is partly correct. But the theory is that some of her unsympathetic qualities were intentional, that the writers designed her to embody the audience's discomfort with moral ambiguity in a way that made her an easy target, and that the discomfort she generated was the point. Laurie makes bad decisions, changes her position without clear motivation, demands things from Rick while resisting accountability for her own choices. The theory is that this was the show's attempt to write a genuinely complicated woman who is neither fully sympathetic nor clearly villainous, and that the execution was uneven but the intention was real, and that her death, the most agonizing death in the show's first 3 seasons, was designed to make us feel the cost of the resentment we'd been carrying toward her. You wanted her to have less, the show says. Here, Rick kills Shane. Rick's son kills the reanimated Shane. Rick carries this for years, the guilt, the complication of killing his best friend, who is also sleeping with his wife and planning his murder. This is substantial psychological material. And the show never gives Rick the scene where he processes the fact that Shane loved Laurie and Carl. That whatever Shane became, the origin of that becoming was something recognizable as love. A man who stepped into a gap that Rick's absence had created and found that he couldn't step back out of it. The theory is that the forgiveness scene that never happened is one of the show's largest narrative debts. Not because Shane deserved forgiveness exactly, but because Rick deserved the chance to decide whether to offer it. Negan is the show's most written about villain, which means I'm going to try to focus on the angles that don't get as much coverage. Not the obvious analysis of his charisma or his villainy, but the structural and thematic things the show embedded in the Saviour's storyline that it never quite articulated directly. This is the most uncomfortable theory in this section, so let's just get into it. Negan's rules for the Saviours: no rape, period, no killing, without his explicit approval, a structured tribute system that kept multiple communities functioning, represent the most codified social contract of any group in the show's run-up to the Commonwealth. Strip away how it was enforced, which was brutally, and look at what it produced. Communities survived under it. The Saviours themselves were organised enough to have specialisations, surplus production, and a functioning economy. The Sanctuary was, by any measure of post-apocalyptic functionality, more sophisticated than Alexandria at the start of Season 7. The theory is that the show doesn't want you to see this, because acknowledging it would complicate the moral clarity of Rick's resistance. But it's there in the text, and the fact that the show eventually moved Negan toward redemption rather than simply killing him off suggests that even the writers couldn't entirely dismiss it. Negan named Lucille after his wife. His wife became a wall he burned down the house with her inside rather than putting her down. These facts are established across the comic and the show, though the show handles the backstory with variable directness across seasons. The theory is about what this means in practice. Every time Negan swings Lucille, every time he uses her as a weapon, every time he talks to her in quiet moments, he's still in relationship with a dead thing. The bat is both memorial and refusal to mourn. He can't kill the walker that was his wife, so he carries the name forward and finds utility in it, because if the name is useful, then the death wasn't just loss. The theory extends. This is why Negan is so specifically disturbed by the idea of mercy-killing walkers that were once loved ones. It's an indictment of the choice he made. Every walker that the group quietly and mercifully puts down is a rebuke to what Negan decided he couldn't do. Negan was a high school gym teacher and coach before the apocalypse. He had a general education, probably including some history. And the tribute system he designed, communities producing goods that are collected at regular intervals by a more powerful organisation in exchange for protection from that organisation's violence, is feudalism. Fairly specific, fairly accurate feudalism. The theory is that this wasn't accidental, that Negan looked at the post-apocalyptic landscape and consciously decided that the most stable large-scale social organisation available to him was the model that worked for hundreds of years of European history before the Industrial Revolution replaced it. He was right, historically. Medieval feudalism was extremely durable. It was also, for the people at the bottom of it, often terrible, which was apparently not a deal-breaker for him. Simon's massacre of the Oceanside men, killing every male over the age of 10 after a community tried to resist the Saviours, is revealed in Season 8 as an action he took on his own initiative, and Negan explicitly states this was outside his orders. But the theory is that it wasn't the first time, that Simon had a pattern of solving compliance problems with elimination rather than coercion, and that Negan was aware of this pattern and had been choosing to ignore it because Simon was effective and because the specific results, while horrifying, were achieving the compliance Negan needed. The theory about institutional leadership that this implies is fairly grim. Systems that reward results without auditing methods will always produce people like Simon, because Simon is what results without methods looks like. The sanctuary's internal economy, workers on the lower floors, saviours with privileged access to resources, a structured point system for obtaining goods, is often read as pure exploitative hierarchy. And it is, but it's also, from a resource management perspective, more sophisticated than the barter and goodwill system that Alexandria was running. The sanctuary had something close to a division of labour, surplus production that was intentionally maintained rather than consumed, and a distribution mechanism that, while inequitable, was at least systematic. The theory is that if you could somehow separate the social structure from the economic one, if you could keep the sanctuary's resource management without the threat of Lucille, you'd have something that resembled a functional small economy, and that the show was aware of this, which is why it eventually moved toward integrating the Saviours into the allied communities rather than simply destroying the infrastructure they'd built. Negan's relationships are almost entirely structured around fear, either the fear he inspires in others or the performance of fearlessness he maintains himself. The Saviours are afraid of him. The tribute communities are afraid of him. Even his inner circle manages him rather than simply being with him. Carl Grimes, from their very first one-on-one interaction, is not afraid of Negan. He's furious and he's grieving, and he'll clearly die before he flinches. And the theory is that this registers to Negan as something almost sacred, a person whose response to him is not managed, not performed, not tactical. Carl doesn't have a strategy for dealing with Negan. He just reacts as himself. For a man who has been surrounded by performed relationships since the moment he assumed power, encountering someone who doesn't perform is genuinely disorienting. Negan's specific gentleness with Carl, which the show treats as one of his most humanizing qualities, is the theory's primary evidence. The decision to spare Negan at the end of Season 8 is usually read as either Rick honouring Carl's dying wish or Rick having a sudden moment of civilizational vision. The theory is more cold-blooded than either of those readings. Rick Grimes is not a soft person by Season 8. He has made hard decisions consistently for years, and most of those decisions have been justified by results. The theory is that keeping Negan alive was a deliberate experiment. Can you take a person who became that, who built that system and enforced it with that level of violence, and reconstruct them into something useful? Is the making of Negan reversible? And if it is, what does that imply about the making of every other monster the apocalypse has produced, including, on certain days, Rick himself? The Governor died for what he did. Gareth died. Dawn died. The Wolves died. Alpha died. Every character in the show who committed atrocities at the level Negan did was eventually killed as a consequence of those atrocities. And then Negan wasn't. The theory is that this was either the show's most mature gesture, an acknowledgement that justice in the real world is not always punishment, that rehabilitation is a legitimate alternative. That consequence can take forms other than death, or its most commercially motivated decision, made because Jeffrey Dean Morgan was too valuable to lose, and the showrunners wanted to keep the character going across multiple seasons. The theory doesn't adjudicate between these readings. It just notes that they both exist and that the show never quite committed clearly enough to the rehabilitation argument to fully silence the commercial one. The Walking Dead makes a few references to Beta's pre-apocalypse identity. He was apparently a celebrity of some kind, a musician or entertainer, and his face is recognizable enough that other characters have had reactions to seeing him unmasked. But the show never names the specific ident. The show repeatedly provides clips, albums, and references to Beta's past work, tot oint. The theory is that this was a deliberate storytelling decision, and the right one. Beta's entire arc is about the erasure of the pre-apocalypse self. He has committed to his Whisperer identity more completely than almost any other character in the show has committed to anything. Naming his former identity would reintroduce that self, would make him human in a way the narrative didn't want him to be. The viewer's inability to access who he was is the point. It's what being Beta costs. The Whisperers are the show's most philosophically interesting villain faction, which is saying something for a show that has produced the Governor, Negan, and the Seerim. They're interesting because their ideology isn't about control or tribute or population management. It's about negation, the deliberate erasure of everything that makes human civilization possible, argued as liberation rather than destruction. The theory here is about Alpha's pre-Whisperer history, which the show outlines in fragments. The conclusion the theory draws is that she didn't arrive at civilization is weakness as an abstract philosophical position. She arrived at it empirically. She was part of something, or witnessed something, that failed catastrophically, and the failure provided a specific evidentiary basis for rejecting everything the failed community had built on. The Whisperers weren't founded on a philosophy, they were founded on a collapse. Alpha took the lessons of a specific disaster and extended them into a total ideology. This is how most extreme worldviews form. Not through abstract reasoning, but through a traumatic event that seems to prove the abstract reasoning after the fact. The camouflage function of wearing walker skin is the practical explanation, and it works. Walkers don't attack Whisperers in their skin because the Whisperers smell and move like walkers. That's straightforward. But the theory is that the camouflage was never the primary function, at least not for the founders and true believers. The wearing of skin is a ritual act in the anthropological sense. It transforms the wearer, marks a transition, communicates belonging to a community with specific values. Ancient cultures wore animal skins to absorb the strength or spirit of the animal. The whisperers wear walker skin to absorb the supposed freedom of the walker, the freedom from civilization, from attachment, from the vulnerability that comes with caring about things. It's theology. The walkers are not disguises, they are vestments. The show treats Lydia's defection from the whisperers to the aligned communities as a triumph, and on one level it is. But the theory is about how the show frames that triumph, not as a natural result of exposure to better values, not as the inevitable flowering of a good person from bad circumstances, but as something that required specific, almost unlikely conditions. To prod you, Lydia was raised from early childhood in a collapsing world and later among the whisperers, an environment that systematically eliminated attachment, trust, hope, and identity. Tighty. She emerged from it with the capacity to choose differently. The theory is that the show presents this not as proof that goodness is innate, but as evidence of how narrowly it survives the conditions designed to erase it. Lydia made it out. Most people wouldn't have. That's the honest reading. Beta is enormous, physically formidable, functionally terrifying. He is also, by the theory's reading, one of the most psychologically dependent characters in the show. His devotion to Alpha reads, in the clinical sense, as the specific codependency of a person who had completely lost the capacity to define themselves independently, and found in Alpha a structure that made their existence legible again. The grief he displays after Alpha's death isn't the grief of someone who has lost a leader or a love, it's the grief of someone who has lost the context in which they made sense. And the theory about what comes after, his decision to continue the Whisperers without Alpha, his eventual death, is that he was never capable of survival as an individual, only as part of a system that someone else was holding together. The border of the Whisperers' territory, marked with impaled heads on spikes, including heads that the viewer recognizes as people they cared about, is one of the show's most deliberately horrifying visual moments. And the theory is about the sophistication behind it. Alpha didn't create the border to kill people. She created it to communicate something specific to the communities she was warning. I understand what you value. I know who matters to you. I can reach inside your community and take the people you love and use them as architecture. The heads aren't just a warning about territorial incursion, they're a demonstration of intelligence. Alpha showing that she's been watching, that she knows your faces, that she understands your grief. This requires planning, observation, and a genuine theory of mind about the communities she was threatening. Alpha was not feral, she was precise. This is the mirror theory for the Whisperer arc, and I find it one of the most illuminating things you can say about why the Whisperers work as antagonists. The main cast has always been defined by community, by the bonds formed across seasons, by the specific weight of collective survival. Remove those bonds and what's left? Alpha is what Rick Grimes becomes if Carl dies in season 1 and there's nobody left to anchor him. Beta is what Daryl becomes if he never finds a group worth protecting. Lydia is what Carl becomes if he grows up in the Whisperers rather than with Rick's people. The show doesn't make these parallels explicit, but they're in the architecture of the antagonist group, and they're part of why the Whisperer War feels so personal for the surviving characters. Fighting Alpha is fighting the thing they all could have become. The narrative around Negan's killing of Alpha in season 10 is framed as a moment of redemption, the beginning of Negan earning his place back among living people. And there's something to that, but the theory is about what the show is actually arguing structurally. every civilized institution struggles to deploy monsters, to use people capable of severe violence without becoming the thing it's using them to fight. The Walking Dead community's use of Negan against Alpha is the show's most direct engagement with this problem. They didn't use him because he had become good. They used him because he was the specific kind of terrible that could get close enough to Alpha to do what needed doing. The theory is that the show is honest about this. That Negan's arc is not redemption as character transformation, so much as redemption as demonstrated utility, which is a more complicated and more realistic kind of redemption than most television provides. The Whisperers represent the total rejection of civilization, the argument that human social organization is a vulnerability rather than a strength. The Commonwealth, which follows them in the narrative, represents the opposite extreme, civilization preserved so completely, so rigidly, that it has reconstructed every hierarchy and inequity of the old world without questioning whether those hierarchies were worth keeping. The theory is that the sequence was intentional, that the writers placed the Whisperers and the Commonwealth in immediate succession to generate a specific contrast. No civilization versus preserved civilization. And the show's argument, made across both arcs, is that the answer lies in neither extreme. Not the Whisperers' liberation through erasure, not the Commonwealth's security through replication. Something new, which none of the existing communities have fully managed, and which the surviving characters are still in the process of trying to build. I want to take a small detour from character-focused theories to talk about the show's locations, because the places the show chooses to centre its stories are as carefully constructed as its characters, and there are theories embedded in the geography that don't get enough attention. The group's time at Herschel's farm in Season 2 is presented, in terms of screen time and pacing, as a relatively extended and slow-burning period at Riod. But the in-universe timeline, assembled by fans who track things like seasonal lighting and agricultural details in the background, suggests the group was actually there for something close to a full winter. Months. The theory about what was lost in the compression is specific. Rest. The farm represented the first time the group had been genuinely stationary, genuinely safe for long enough to recover, to process the first year of the apocalypse, to rebuild something like relationships and routines. Compressing this into what feels like a few weeks removes the show's best argument for why the group bonds as deeply as they did spend a few weeks on a farm. They spent months at the farm. Untier, and the bonds formed across a winter of relative peace are different from the bonds formed in constant crisis. The prison arc covers roughly 8 to 9 months of in-universe time across seasons 3. It's one of the longest single-location arcs in the show, and the theory is that this duration is precisely why it works. Why the prison feels more real, more inhabited, more emotionally loaded than any subsequent location in the series. Rise. The group builds something at the prison. They clear cells, establish a council, develop a community with its own social structure, fight a flu epidemic, manage an external threat. And you believe all of this happened because the show gave it time to happen. The theory about the later seasons is the counterpart. After the prison, the show consistently compressed its location arcs, moved the group faster, gave them less time to actually inhabit the places they were in, and the later settings never felt as real as the prison. The Turmihnus backstory, that the original community was overrun by violent outsiders who committed terrible acts, and that the survivors eventually reclaimed the location and became the hunters, is one of the show's clearest statements about how trauma becomes ideology. The theory is about the specific shape of this transformation. The Turmihnus survivors didn't just become violent, they became specifically the kind of violence that had been done to them. The thing that destroyed their original community was predatory behaviour toward vulnerable people. The thing they became was predatory behaviour toward vulnerable people. This is the cycle of violence argument made in very compact narrative form. The theory notes that the show resolves this arc in a single episode rather than exploring it, which suggests the writers either didn't know what to do with the complexity or made a deliberate choice to keep the Tuamichnus group from becoming too sympathetic. Season 1 is a world of shock and immediacy. There's no time to grieve because there's no time for anything, just the immediate work of surviving a catastrophe in real time. Seasons 2 is the farm, and the farm is the show's last act of hope. The possibility, entertained briefly, that maybe this is survivable, maybe the world can hold something like normal life, maybe the children can grow up somewhere safe. The barn kills that hope, and the theory is that the farm as a location is the physical container of everything the group might have been before they became the people Season 3 requires them to be. After the barn, the show's geography changes, the prison is institutional, the road is transitional. Alexandria is aspirational, but never quite warm in the same way the farm was. The farm was home. The show never found another Aaron's recruitment of Rick's group on the road in Season 5 is presented as a deliberate approach. A recruiter who has been tracking a survivor group he believes is the right fit for Alexandria. But the theory is that the encounter wasn't coincidental at all. Alexandria had extensive intelligence gathering operations. Aaron's recruitment mission across a large geographic area implies a systematic cataloguing of survivor groups. The theory is that Rick's group, which had been making significant noise since at least Season 4, the fall of the prison, the events at Tuamichnus, was already known to Alexandria's leadership by the time Aaron made contact, that the decision to recruit them specifically was made before Aaron left, not when he happened to encounter them, and that Deanna Monroe, who seems to know exactly what she's doing when she interviews each group member, had already done research. The Season 9 time jump, 6 years after the bridge explosion, 6 years in which the communities built something in Rick's absence, is a storytelling device the show made necessary by Andrew Lincoln's departure, and there's no clean way to handle it. But the theory is about what was lost in the skip. 6 years of communities learning to cooperate without a central, charismatic figure. 6 years of the saviour integration, which should have been one of the most interesting and most difficult social experiments in the show's history. 6 years of Judith growing from an infant into a child with opinions. 6 years of what rebuilding actually looks like when the cameras aren't running. The boring, essential, unglamorous work of fixing infrastructure and managing conflict and deciding who gets to make decisions about the shared food supply. The theory is that this was always going to be the most important story the show had to tell, and it chose the explosion rather than tell it. The question is, what does civilization require? And the show's answer changes with every major setting. Herschel's farm says civilization requires faith in other people, in recovery, in the possibility that what was lost can be rebuilt. The prison says civilization requires institutions, shared rules, shared space, shared governance, even imperfect governance. The Governor's Woodbury says civilization requires order, and that order is worth almost any price. Tuamichnus says civilization was always a performance, and the hunters have simply dropped the performance. Alexandria says civilization requires hope, the stubborn insistence that there is something worth building even when the evidence is ambiguous. The Kingdom says civilization requires story, that kings and courts and theatre are not luxuries but necessities. The Sanctuary says civilization requires a strong hand at the top. The Commonwealth says civilization requires memory of the old world, even the worst parts of it. The show doesn't adjudicate cleanly between these answers. It presents them one after another and lets the audience sit with the weight of all of them. One of the show's structural habits, and I'm not sure how consciously it was employed, but it's there, is the shadow character. Almost every major protagonist in the show has a character who runs alongside them at a certain point, embodying what the protagonist would be under a different set of conditions. The shadow usually dies, the protagonist usually survives. The death of the shadow is, on some level, always about defining the shape of the protagonist who continues. The pattern: Rick has Shane, the version who chooses efficiency over ethics. Glenn has Nicholas, the version who chooses self-preservation over the group. Carol has Lizzie, the version whose response to the apocalypse is psychotic dissociation rather than pragmatic adaptation. Morgan has Eastman, the version who found peace, and note that Eastman dies so Morgan can carry his principles forward. Negan has Simon, the version who didn't have even Negan's attenuated restraints. Alpha has the version of Carol that could have formed if Sophia's death had produced nihilism rather than resolve. The theory is that the shadows die so the primaries can continue, so the show can explore the worst possible version of a character's arc without committing its protagonist to it. It's a structural device, and it's a fairly elegant one. The shadows tell us who the protagonists are by showing us who they chose not to become. Rick, Daryl, Morgan, Glenn, Negan, the male characters who undergo significant transformation across the series, generally do so through the accretion of experience. They add to themselves, acquire new capabilities, harden in some areas while opening in others. Michonne, Carol, Maggie, Rosita, Sasha, the female characters' transformation arcs are more consistently about the shedding of a previous Michonne before the apocalypse was a lawyer, someone with a specific social identity that the apocalypse erased, said. Carol before the apocalypse was an abused housewife. Maggie was a farmer's daughter. What they become in the series is something their pre-apocalypse selves would not recognise. The theory is about what the show does with this. It presents these transformations as cost rather than triumph. The women don't become more powerful versions of who they were. They become different people who carry the memory of who they were as a kind of wound. And the show, mostly without comment, acknowledges that this is the specific price the apocalypse exacted from people who had already been working against social constraints that most of the men around them hadn't been living. And Abraham Ford is a character who entered the series as a man with only one thing left to live for: his family dead, his purpose, the mission to Washington, driving him forward, his capacity for hope apparently destroyed, yet. And across seasons 5 and 6, he rebuilt. He found Sasha. He found genuine affection for the group. He found something that, while not uncomplicated, constituted a reason to keep going. By the time of the Negan lineup in the season 6 and 7 premiere, Abraham had been mourning for long enough and had been reconstructing long enough that the show's assessment of his interior state was, by the evidence, peace. Not happiness, peace. The theory is that his final statement, the now famous "suck my nuts" directed at Negan, is the show encoding this. It's defiant, unbowed, characteristic, and utterly without fear. He was at peace when he died. The arc was Compel Carl Grimes is one of the characters in The Walking Dead who begins as a child and grows toward adulthood entirely within the apocalypse CPC. Every question the show asks about what children owe to the world they inherit, what they're entitled to, what they're capable of, what the adults around them are obligated to provide, is carried in Carl's body and Carl's choices. The theory is that his death in season 8 was the show cutting off its own argument before it could see its conclusion. Carl at adulthood would have had to make decisions that Rick has never had to make. Not how to survive the world that exists, but what kind of world to build from scratch. That's the question the show kept deferring. Carl's death deferred it permanently. And the show never quite found the same argumentative clarity again, because the person the argument was about was gone. Classical tragic heroes begin in community, in relationship, in social function, and descend through isolation as the tragedy unfolds. Michonne begins the series in the opposite position: complete isolation, a deliberate withdrawal from any connection, a state of absolute self-sufficiency that she has chosen as the price of survival. Her arc is the reverse of classical tragedy. from isolation toward community, from closed toward open, from the armor of not caring toward the vulnerability of caring again. For Carl, for Judith, for Rick. This structural reversal is what makes her arc the most hopeful in the franchise. And the theory is that it was built this way deliberately, as the counterpoint to the show's general movement toward moral complexity and compromise. Michonne's arc says the movement toward connection is always possible. It costs something, but it's always possible. Herschel's function in the show is specific. He is the character whose opinions on what the group owes to the world structure the group's debates with themselves. He's the person who forces the question. When Herschel says something is wrong, it's wrong in a way that requires a serious answer, not just dismissal. His death at the governor's hands in the Season 4 mid-season finale removes this function from the show permanently, and the theory is that the show tried to fill it repeatedly across subsequent seasons without ever quite succeeding. Bob Stuckey has some of the function, Tyrese has some of it, Father Gabriel eventually develops some of it, but none of them have the specific authority Herschel had, which came from being the person who was right about the most important things, the most consistently over the longest period of time. The show kept introducing new communities and new leaders, partly because it was looking, in the landscape of the apocalypse, for someone who could finish what Herschel started. The barn in Caesar Judith is born in Season 3 and is still alive by the end of the series. On 3, these two events, in close succession, constitute what the theory argues is the actual turning point of the series. Not the knee gun premiere, not the dumpster fake out, but this. Rick kills his best friend, his son watches, and then Carl has to kill his mother to prevent her from reanimating, while his father is somewhere else. In a world where parents are supposed to protect children from the worst things, a child protects a parent. A child does the mercy kill his father couldn't be there to do. The theory is that this reversal, the inversion of the protective dynamic, the child becoming the one who acts while the parent fails to arrive in time, is the defining wound of the series, and that everything that breaks afterward can be traced to this, not to knee gun, to the field and the prison, and what a boy had to do there, not because Glenn was the best character, though he's a strong candidate, because Glenn was the show's most functional optimist, and optimism, in a survival narrative, has a specific structural role that pessimism can't fill. Glenn's belief that survival was possible, that good outcomes were achievable, that the people around him were worth the risk of attachment. This belief was not naive, because Glenn was smart enough to know better, and chose it anyway. That kind of chosen optimism is rare and fragile, and when it dies, the show can't easily replace it. What the show has after Glenn is endurance, characters who survive because they're too stubborn or too determined to stop, which is admirable but different. The theory is that after Glenn's death, the show became a different kind of story. Not a story about what's possible, but a story about what can be sustained. 7 seasons of elaborate, carefully constructed death scenes, and none of them hit the way the barn did. The theory about why is fairly specific. The barn works because of the 11 episodes that precede 7 episodes of the group searching for Sophia, maintaining hope that she might be alive, organising their lives around the possibility of finding her. The audience spends 11 episodes building attachment to an outcome. And then the barn opens, and the outcome is inside, and it's been inside the whole time, and there was never any hope. The show earned that devastation through 11 episodes of accumulated hope. No subsequent death had that kind of preparation time. The theory isn't that the later deaths were poorly executed, some of them are genuinely excellent, but that the show could only buy this specific kind of heartbreak once, and it spent it in a barn in Season 2. Bob Stuckey, having had his leg amputated by the 2 Amichnus cannibals, and then having been brought to their dinner table as an unwilling participant, reveals that the leg they've been eating came from a walker bite victim. He laughs. He genuinely laughs. Tainted meat, he says. You're eating tainted meat. The theory here is production-focused. The writers needed one moment of genuine absurdist relief after the Gareth arc, which had been relentlessly grim, and they found it in Bob's specific joy at the fact that the worst thing that had happened to him was also funny. He was dying. He knew he was dying, and the last thing he did before that fact became undeniable was laugh at the people who'd eaten his leg. The show is not generally a comedy, but it understood in this moment that the line between tragedy and comedy is thinner than it looks, and that Bob Stookey, a man who had been finding ways to keep going since long before the apocalypse, would find the funny part even here. Father Gabriel Stokes enters the series with a specific backstory. He locked his congregation out of the church during the initial outbreak to save himself, and they died outside the doors he'd barricaded. He's presented initially as a coward, and that reading drives his early character work. But the theory is that cowardice is the wrong diagnosis. The specific psychology of what Gabriel did and what he carries is much closer to survivor's guilt. Not the guilt of a person who acted out of self-preservation, but the guilt of a person who had already, before the moment of crisis, decided he didn't deserve to survive. His congregation wasn't asking him to save them. They were asking him to take responsibility for their salvation. And Father Gabriel, in that moment, couldn't make that claim. Couldn't say, "Come in, I am worth being with, my shelter is worth your trust," because he'd already decided he wasn't. The door wasn't cowardice, it was self-punishment wearing the mask of cowardice. His arc across the seasons, becoming one of Alexandria's most important defenders, finding something worth protecting, discovering that he is, in fact, capable of the thing he thought he wasn't, is the show working through this specific psychological wound. And the theory notes that the show handles this more carefully than it's usually given credit for. This is the section where we get properly into the weeds. These are the theories that require knowing episode-specific details, production history, or fairly niche corners of the lore before they start to make any sense. Some of them are solidly supported, some of them are delightful speculation. All of them are the kind of thing you find at 2 a.m. on a thread that's 3 years old. Eugene Porter lied about having a cure. This is established fact, confirmed in Season 5. The standard reading is that the lie was a survival mechanism. Eugene, who understands his own physical limitations acutely, needed something that would make people protect him, and a cure was the most valuable thing he could offer. But the theory extends this into something more psychologically specific. Eugene, before the apocalypse, had an identity. He was smart, he was an expert, he had knowledge that mattered. The apocalypse destroyed the context in which his expertise was meaningful. A cure to the zombie virus was the one formulation that restored the old identity in a new context. He wasn't just lying to survive, he was lying to remain the person he understood himself to be. The loss of the lie in Season 5 isn't just practical, it's the death of the self-concept that had been holding him together. Enid appears in the show when Carl needs to process loss and disappears when he doesn't. Her function, the mysterious girl outside the walls, the person who sees the apocalypse without blinking, the person who offers Carl a framework for surviving grief, is specifically responsive to Carl's arc rather than independent of it. The theory isn't unkind to the character, exactly. It's observational. Enid exists where Carl needs her to exist and recedes where Carl doesn't need her. Her death in Season 9, quick, shocking, shortly after Carl's own death, reads in this light as the show discarding a tool it had built for a specific purpose, once the purpose had ended. The tool wasn't the character's fault. The tool was just what she was asked to be. Aaron's arc from his first appearance, as a recruiter for Alexandria, someone who believes deeply in what the community is trying to build, to his role in the later seasons as one of its most committed defenders is, in the theory's framing, the show's clearest argument about institutions and the people who make them work. Institution's F. Alexandria survived in season 6-6. Its social norms failed. Its security failed. Its leadership failed. What didn't fail was Aaron's belief in what it was supposed to be, and his willingness to keep working toward that thing even when the institution itself was inadequate. The theory is that this is how institutions survive, not through bureaucratic inertia, but through individuals who believe in the idea of them enough to keep improving them from inside. Aaron is the show's case study for this argument, and the fact that it took him 11 seasons to get enough screen time to make it is one of the show's more notable oversights. Sudeik's arc in seasons 9 and 10, dealing with the aftermath of witnessing the Whisperers murder the people who became the border markers, the intrusive memories, the avoidance behaviour, the fragmented recall, has been noted by viewers with clinical psychology backgrounds as unusually accurate. The theory is production-focused. Someone in the writing room for those seasons had either direct experience with PTSD or specifically researched clinical presentations, and the result is a trauma portrayal that doesn't rely on dramatic breakdown or convenient recovery, but instead shows the specific texture of living with intrusive traumatic memory. The fragmented quality of Sudeik's flashbacks, the way he can function in most contexts but loses access to his own experience under specific triggers, the way recovery is gradual and partial rather than complete. These are accurate. The theory is that this was intentional, and it represents the show doing something clinically honest that it doesn't do very often. Theodore Douglas, T-Dog, is one of the Atlanta camp's original survivors and one of the show's most carefully understated supporting characters. He's not given much dialogue, but the dialogue he has is consistently good, and his arc across seasons 1-3 suggests a character being developed towards something larger. And then he's killed in a fairly abrupt Walker attack in season 3, episode 4, in an episode that's also dealing with the revelation of Laurie's death. The theory, and this is one of the less provable theories in this section because the production decisions behind casting changes are rarely confirmed, is that T-Dog's death was driven by factors external to the story. A contract dispute, a scheduling conflict, a decision made at the production level that then required a story justification. The abruptness of his exit, the way it doesn't quite match the care the show had been taking with him, and the timing in an episode with an enormous amount of other emotional freight all suggest a decision made under pressure rather than planned well in advance. Dale Horvath is the Atlanta camp's conscience, and he's often read as a nagging presence, a man whose moral objections to group decisions are genuine but sometimes impractical. But the theory about what Dale was actually doing is more interesting than that. The theory is that Dale's interventions in the group's moral debates were strategically, rather than purely reactively motivated. He understood that a group under survival pressure will choose expedience over ethics unless someone consistently makes the cost of that choice visible. He wasn't just reacting to bad decisions, he was creating the conditions under which the group had to argue about its values, making sure that no decision of moral significance got made in silence. His death in season 2 removes this function, and the show marks it immediately. The very next episode, the group makes the decision to execute the prisoner Randall, which Dale had been the primary objector to. Without Dale to force the argument ends. Philip Blake, the governor, is one of the show's most analysed characters, and a lot of that analysis focuses on the apparent inconsistency between his public persona, the reasonable, even charismatic leader of Woodbury, and his private behaviour. The theory is that this apparent inconsistency resolves once you understand that fascist political performance always requires a public face. The governor's charm, his reasonableness, his apparent community investment, these are not masks over his true self, which is the brutal private persona. They're part of the same political project. The public face keeps people compliant and cooperative. The private face maintains power through fear and violence. The governor is not performing reasonableness while being secretly terrible. He's performing two different instruments in the same orchestration. His mistake, and it's a consistent one, is underestimating how closely people watch when they start to feel unsafe. This is technically a repeat of a point made in section 11, but it belongs in this section too because it's worth approaching from a different angle, the production theory. The 11-episode build-up to the barn is one of the most divisive creative decisions in the show's history. Critics at the time called it too slow. Viewers who stuck with it generally agree in retrospect that the slowness was the point. The theory is that the show's creative team understood, as they were making season 2, that they were spending something that couldn't be recovered. That building this specific kind of emotional investment over this many episodes around an outcome this devastating would establish a precedent for the show's emotional stakes that it would spend the rest of its run trying to live up to. And that the decision to spend it on Sophia, not a main character, not an adult, a child, was specifically designed to communicate that the show's world had no protected categories. Season 1 covers approximately 2 weeks in universe time. Season 2 covers several months. The seasons after that cover years, sometimes with explicit time jumps, sometimes with compression that isn't formally acknowledged by season 11. The show has been running for over a decade in universe time, with all of the psychological and physical implications that carries Raya's. The theory is that this acceleration was always going to happen, that the storytelling imperatives of a show in a post-apocalyptic setting would always pull toward faster time passage, because slow time is boring time in drama, but that the show never fully addressed what acceleration meant for its characters. The people in season 11 have been living in the apocalypse for something like 12 years. They should be fundamentally different people. And sometimes they are, but sometimes the show treats them as if the apocalypse started last Tuesday, and the theory is that this inconsistency is one of the reasons later seasons sometimes feel less real than early ones. Carl Grimes, by the established in-universe timeline, should be somewhere between 14 and 16 by the time of his death in season 8. He's played for most of the show as significantly younger. His decision-making, his relationship to authority, his emotional vocabulary, all of it reads in the text of the show as a younger child than the timeline would support. The theory is that this was a deliberate choice, driven by what the writers wanted Carl to represent: innocence surviving the apocalypse, childhood persisting against odds, the possibility of the next generation. Writing Carl as a fully adolescent person would have required writing someone who was forming adult opinions and making adult decisions and developing adult conflicts with his father. That version of Carl would have been less symbolically useful and dramatically more complicated. The show chose symbol over realism. The Commonwealth restores pre-apocalypse social hierarchies almost exactly, returning people to their pre-outbreak jobs and social positions, maintaining clear class distinctions between the well-resourced and the working population, structuring access to resources and housing and opportunity along lines that are explicitly based on what people had before. The theory is that this is deliberate satire, built into the Commonwealth's design by writers who wanted to make a specific argument, that given the opportunity to rebuild from scratch, most human societies will recreate the inequalities of the old world without questioning whether those inequalities were worth recreating. The Commonwealth isn't a critique of the post-apocalypse, it's a critique of the world before it. The apocalypse changed nothing about the social logic because the social logic was in the people, not the institutions. Pamela Milton's son, Sebastian, is one of the show's more overtly unsympathetic characters. Incompetent, self-important, dangerous, in the specific way that powerful people with poor judgment are dangerous. His eventually killing a sympathetic character, and the fallout from that killing is the event that begins the Commonwealth's unravelling. The theory is about what Sebastian represents structurally. The Commonwealth's governing system allows authority to pass through hereditary connection. Pamela leads, Sebastian inherits a degree of protection from that leadership. And the argument the theory extracts is familiar from actual political history. Any system that allows unearned authority to accumulate around lineage will eventually be consumed by the person at the end of that lineage, who has all the authority and none of the competence. Sebastian didn't destroy the Commonwealth, he exposed the mechanism by which it was always going to destroy itself. This is the one Kirkman confirmed in interviews, and yet it keeps surprising people when they hear it for the first time, which is why it belongs here. The title of the show, The Walking Dead, is not about the walkers. The walkers are not the walking dead. The title refers to the survivors, people who are, technically, still alive, walking through a world that has died around them. Walking through death. The Walking Dead. The theory this generates is about what this framing implies for the show's central argument. If the title is about the living, then the show's central horror is not reanimation. It's not the walkers. It's the experience of being a living person in a dead world. The specific grief and endurance and exhaustion of continuing to move through a world that has lost most of what made it worth moving through. The walkers are a symptom. The Walking Dead are its survivors. The Atlanta camp in Season 1 has roughly 27 members. By the best counts viewers have assembled. By Season 5, after the fall of the prison and the events at Tuamichnus, the surviving members of that original group are Rick, Carl, Daryl, Glenn, Maggie and Carol. 6 people, 22%. I've thought about this number a lot, honestly. It's bleak on paper, but the theory is about how the show frames it, and the show frames it as the nucleus around which something new can be built. 6 people who have survived everything the world has thrown at them, who know each other deeply, who constitute a community of trust that the show has spent 5 seasons building. 22% is not a triumph in any normal context. In this context, 6 people from an original group of 27 making it to Season 5 together is, by any reasonable measure, extraordinary. The show is right to treat it that way. We already talked about the gurney in Theory 37, the anonymous act of care, the first hero of the story. But the theory worth sitting with here is slightly different. It's about what the show is doing by never giving that person a name or a face or a resolution. The entire franchise is, in one sense, a celebration of named, visible heroism. Rick, Daryl, Michonne, Carol, people whose faces we know and whose sacrifices we're asked to remember. And the show begins with an act of heroism that will never be remembered, by a person who will never be known, whose only audience is a comatose stranger. The theory is that the show understands something about the ratio here. For every named, visible act of courage, there were 1,000 like this one. Uncredited, unwitnessed, gone. And the show knows it can't show you those. It can just put one of them in the first frame and let you understand what the rest of the story is standing on. I'll be honest, I watched all of it, including the parts that I couldn't in good conscience recommend. And the thing I keep finding is that the spin-offs, taken as a whole body of work, rather than as individual shows evaluated on their own merits, contain an enormous amount of information about the main show's world that you simply can't access otherwise. Some of it was clearly planned, some of it was clearly retroactive. All of it is interesting. Madison Clark and Rick Grimes are both community builders. They're both willing to do terrible things to protect the people they love. They're both capable of exceptional leadership under pressure. And yet the theory is that if their groups had met during the early seasons, they would have been unable to function as a combined community within a short period of time. Rick's group's philosophy, by Season 5, is built around a specific hierarchy of trust. You earn full belonging through demonstrated loyalty over time. The group's interests take precedence over individual interest, and the community's survival justifies most decisions. Madison's philosophy is warmer in its stated goals and more consistently incoherent in its implementation. She makes promises to community members that her survival calculus can't always honour. These aren't compatible philosophies. They're not even the same genre of leadership. Morgan Jones in the main show is one of the most carefully constructed, recurring characters across the first 8 seasons, every reappearance reflecting a different phase of Rick's potential arc, every version of Morgan saying something specific about the cost of the apocalypse. This is discussed in the character mirror section above, and it works. Morgan Jones in Fear the Walking Dead is broken and rebuilt and broken again in a cycle that the theory argues eventually stopped meaning anything. The same arc, loss of philosophy, recovery of philosophy, loss again, repeated enough times stops being character development and starts being a holding pattern. The theory isn't about quality of execution in either show individually. It's about the diminishing returns of a character who carries symbolic weight being asked to carry it past the point where the symbol still has content. It's not a well-regarded show. The pacing is uneven. The young adult framing is at odds with the franchise's general register. The main characters take a while to earn the investment they're asking for. These criticisms are fair, but the theory is that none of this matters as much as what World Beyond delivers. It is the only piece of the franchise that actually develops the CRM into a coherent institution with a coherent ideology. It is the show that reveals the French lab. It is the show that explains what the A and B classifications mean in practice. Without World Beyond, The Ones Who Live has much less context, and Daryl Dixon has much less context, and the entire CRM arc that runs across the latter half of the franchise's run is significantly harder to understand. The theory is that viewers who dismissed World Beyond for its presentation missed everything it was doing for the universe's architecture. Iris West, confrontation. She processes the trauma by moving toward it, by understanding it, by trying to change the thing that caused it. Hope Bennett, flight. Her response is to move away from the source of pain, to find distance, to establish enough physical remove that the pain can't reach her. Elton Ortiz, denial. He manages his grief through a framework of scientific rationalism that keeps emotional access to the loss at bay. Silas Plaskett, internalization. He carries the pain entirely inward, without external expression, until it becomes indistinguishable from his sense of self. The theory is that these 4 responses are a deliberate taxonomy, that the writers designed the 4 main characters to embody different ways of surviving loss, and that the show's arc is an argument that none of these responses, pursued individually, is sufficient. The group needs all 4 of them to function. Just as any real community needs the full range of human response to difficulty, rather than a single optimized approach, Rick Grimes is a prisoner of the CRM, who has also become, over 8 years, a person who has been reshaped by the institution that holds him. He's not quite Rick anymore. He's whatever the CRM has made of My Sean Arrives, is deeply unhappy with the new version, and spends much of the series essentially demanding that the original person come back. The CRM is the building they're negotiating inside. The actual story is much smaller and much more intimate than the franchise scale would suggest. 2 people arguing about whether who you were can survive what you've been through, whether the self persists through that kind of institutional pressure. The theory is that this is the show that fans who loved Rick and Michonne as a couple actually needed, and that it works specifically because it's not really about the CRM at all. This is probably the most speculative theory in this section, and the one that requires the most faith in the franchise's long-term planning, which, given the history of Walking Dead production, is not always justified. But the theory exists and is argued carefully in certain corners of the community. The idea is that the separate threads, Daryl and Carol in France, the CRM aftermath with Rick and Michonne, the Padre survivors from FTWD, the Commonwealth's aftermath, are all narratively pointed in the same direction. Not toward a crossover episode, not toward a reunion special, but toward a single, structural moment where the implications of all these separate stories arrive at the same place simultaneously. The theory doesn't specify what that place looks like. It just argues that the franchise is building toward it, and that the convergence was always the plan, even when individual shows looked like they were wandering. The nuclear explosion arc in Fear the Walking Dead, culminating in the death of Teddy and the detonation of the warheads, is one of the franchise's most divisive story decisions. It's often cited as an example of the show escalating beyond its sustainable logic. But the theory is that the writers were trying to do something specific with it, to introduce a biological escalation in the walker threat that could change the danger profile without fundamentally rewriting the existing rules. Radiation-altered walkers are still walkers. They're just more dangerous. This is, in principle, a viable way to extend the franchise's internal logic across a longer timeline without requiring a new viral explanation. The execution was uneven, but the theory is that the intention was more coherent than most viewers gave it credit for. This one is going to get me into arguments. But the evidence is there if you look at it. Madison Clark, across Fear's run, repeatedly builds functional communities out of worse starting materials than Rick ever. Madison Clark builds a community at the Dell Diamond Baseball Stadium. She does it at the Diamond. She does it at Padre in a form so comprehensive that it survived her supposed death and her extended absence. The theory is that the franchise never made this explicit because making the spin-off's protagonist superior to the main show's hero would have been commercially awkward. And possibly because the main show's mythology had such enormous cultural weight that making the comparison directly would have felt like an attack on it. The theory doesn't say Madison was a better person than Rick, just that she was, by the evidence of outcomes, a more consistently effective community architect. Not tactics, not weapons, not resource management, or community organization or leadership philosophy. The Daryl Dixon spin-off's central argument, accumulating across its first 2 seasons, is that survival, at its most fundamental, requires the ability to be in relationship with people who are not your people. Strangers. People with different languages, different histories, different frameworks for understanding the world. Daryl in France cannot rely on the relationships that sustained him in America. He can't communicate in the way he's used to communicating. He can't assume shared values or shared context. And he survives, and begins to do more than survive, not by forcing the French characters into his framework, but by being genuinely open to theirs. The theory is that this is the franchise's most mature statement about what the apocalypse ultimately requires. Not the hardening that most of the show celebrates, but the specific courage of remaining permeable. Padre Homrahi, the community in the later seasons of Fear the Walking Dead that separates children from their parents and raises them without names, without attachments, without identity, is presented as a villain's project, and functionally it is. But the theory is about the logic behind it. The person who founded Padre had watched community after community collapse, and had identified what they believed was the common mechanism. Adults who loved specific people made decisions that protected those specific people at the expense of the community's broader survival. Attachment was the vulnerability. The solution was to remove attachment in the next generation. This is monstrous. It is also internally coherent. And the theory is that the show includes it because it takes seriously the question of what a person who has seen enough community failures might actually conclude, and that taking it seriously, showing both the logic and the devastation, is more honest than simply having a villain be inexplicably evil. These last theories are the ones I find myself coming back to most often. Not necessarily the most obscure or the most analytically rigorous, just the ones that, if you let them say something true about the show, and about what makes it worth having cared about. We've talked about her in a couple of different contexts tonight, but the theory about what she represents as a narrative device is worth stating plainly. She is the only walker in the show's entire run, whose full story we know before we encounter her. She was a person. She had a life. Something terrible happened to her, and she has been since then in a state of persisting agony, not quite dead, not quite gone, still moving but no longer herself, dragging through a world that doesn't have a framework for what she is. Rick apologizes to her. He says, "I'm sorry this happened to you," and he ends it. The theory is that this is the show's opening argument, delivered in the first 5 minutes. The most humane response to what the world has produced is recognition of what has been lost and mercy toward what remains. Everything the show builds across 11 seasons is a complication of that simple statement. But the statement is still there, at the beginning, defining what the show thinks it's doing. We covered the Kirkman confirmation in Theory 122. The Walking Dead are the survivors, not the walkers. But the specific thing worth adding here is how rarely this changes how people actually talk about the show. Ask most people what The Walking Dead is about, and they'll say zombies, even people who've watched all 11 seasons, even people who love it. The theory is that this mismatch is exactly what the show's about. The gap between what we think we're watching, a horror story about monsters, and what we're actually watching, a story about grief and endurance and the specific exhaustion of being alive when everything around you isn't. The walkers were always the wrong thing to be afraid of. The show told you that in its title, and most people still looked at the walkers. Season 1 is survival horror, stripped down to its essential mechanics. A man wakes up, the world has ended, he needs to find his family. Season 2 is a slow-burn domestic drama, structured around a farm and the conversations that happen when survival pressure eases briefly. Season 3 is a war story. Two communities, a specific threat, the mechanics of conflict and fortification. Season 4 is a character study, spending more time than any previous season on individual psychology and interior experience. Season 5 is a thriller, road-based and kinetic. Season 6 is a political thriller, the mechanics of community governance under siege. Season 7 is an oppression narrative, about what communities do under sustained authoritarian control. Season 8 is a war drama again, larger and more costly than Season 3. Season 9 is a reboot, deliberately re-establishing the show's stakes after the loss of its central character. Season 10 is horror, the Whisperer's arc returning to the genre sensibility of the first season. Season 11 is social critique, the Commonwealth as a direct engagement with contemporary political themes. The theory is that the show couldn't decide what kind of story it was telling, that this genre instability is part of why the later seasons felt inconsistent. But the alternative reading is that the show was always trying to be all of these things at once, and that the genre shifts were an attempt to honour the range of human experience it was working with. Both readings are defensible. Season 11 and the Commonwealth arc bring the series to an ending that is, depending on how you approach it, either a surrender or a resolution. The survivors who had spent 11 seasons rejecting, reforming, and destroying various versions of civilization are now choosing to rebuild one. Not the old world, not the Seerum's vision, but something that learns from the failures the show has been cataloguing since 2010. The theory is that this is the honest ending, not the triumphant one, not the tragic one. The honest one. Civilization is flawed. Building it requires compromises, maintaining it requires vigilance. And the alternative, which the show has shown us in the form of the Whisperers and the roads and the grief, is worse. The survivors choose to build not because building is easy or pure or guaranteed to work, but because the Walking Dead have been walking long enough. It's time to stop and build something to stand in. Not the most screen time, not the most dramatically active, the most important in the theoretical sense. Judith was born in the apocalypse. She has no memory of the world before. She didn't lose anything when civilization collapsed because she never had civilization in the first place. She only has what she's been given since birth. Everything she knows about the world she's living in, she knows from people who are still processing what they lost. She is the first truly post-apocalyptic human the show produced, and everything she does, the kindness, the stubbornness, the capacity for both violence and mercy, the specific combination of hope and realism she embodies, is the show's attempt to imagine what a person might be like who had never been shaped by the world that ended. The theory is that Judith is the answer to the question the show has been asking since Rick woke up. Not Rick, not Michonne, not Daryl, Judith. She's what it was all building toward. This is one of the theories that I find hardest to articulate clearly, but it matters. The show's protagonists, the people whose deaths we grieved, whose choices we argued about, whose relationships we invested in, were not going to be the ones who finally figured out how to live in the world the apocalypse made. They were the wrong generation for that. They carried too much of the world before. The theory is that the show always knew this and structured its deaths accordingly. The people who built the interim, the people who kept something alive through the worst of it, had to go before the people who would inherit it could come into their own. Rick's bridge explosion, Glenn's sacrifice of the show's optimism, Herschel's moral anchor held until it was no longer needed because the group had internalized it. The theory is that these losses were not tragedies in the pure sense. They were payments, the price of keeping something alive long enough for the next generation to receive it. This one is uncomfortable, and I think about it a lot. The answer the show keeps giving, across 11 seasons and however many spin-offs, is that surviving this world requires becoming someone who would make your pre-apocalypse self deeply uncomfortable. Rick Grimes, the King County Sheriff, would not recognize the man who executed the Tuamichnus group in a barn. Carol, the abused housewife, would not recognize Carol, who killed Karen and David to stop the flu. Daryl, the drifter, would not recognize Daryl, who built communities through multiple existential threats. The show isn't celebrating these transformations exactly. It's honest about what they cost, but it insists they were necessary. And that's either the show's deepest truth or its most difficult problem, and I genuinely can't always tell which. I don't think the show always knew how to make political arguments. Some seasons it tried and fumbled it. But the Commonwealth arc lands for me in a specific way. It's the franchise finally committing to a clear position on what rebuilding civilization should not look like. The Commonwealth rebuilt the old world's inequalities almost perfectly. The class structures, the inherited status, the access hierarchies, all of it, preserved and reinstated, as if the apocalypse had been a temporary inconvenience, rather than an opportunity to ask whether any of it was worth keeping. And the show's argument, by the end, is that this is the wrong goal. Not rebuilding itself, building is the right goal. Just not rebuilding that. The theory is that the survivors who walk away from the Commonwealth's collapse have learned something that the old world never managed to fully teach, and that what they do next is the only thing that matters. The red baseball cap Glenn wears in the pilot, the Napa Auto Parts hat, the delivery boy hat, the hat of someone who bicycles around Atlanta with orders, is the first image of Glenn Rhee. It's shorthand for who he was before, the young man who knew every alley in the city, who could get in and out of anywhere, who hadn't yet been asked to be anything more than quick and competent. The cap appears and disappears across the seasons in a way that, the theory argues, tracks his transformation. He's wearing it in the most desperate moments, as though reverting to the person he was before everything asked something of him. And it's gone, not dramatically lost, just quietly absent, in the moments when Glenn is fully present as the person the apocalypse has made him. The theory is that the costume department was paying attention, and that the cap is one of the show's most understated pieces of visual character work. Doors, gates, fences, bridges. The show's visual language is built around liminal spaces, places of transition, of entry and exclusion, of the decision about who gets to be inside and who stays outside. The theory is that this is the show's central metaphor made architectural, Civilization is always a decision about thresholds, about what you let in and what you lock out, about who you extend community to and who you designate as outside it. The governor's walls keeping the walker world at bay while harbouring something worse inside. Alexandria's fencing keeping the group safe while keeping out potential allies. The whisperer border marking the edge of the human claim on the world. Every major moral decision in the show is also, on the visual level, a decision about a door or a gate or a wall. The show understands this about itself. The sanctuary's internal layout, workers on the ground floor, saviors on the upper levels, with a clear, visible hierarchy in the quality and quantity of resources at each level, is the theory's focus here. The workers live in a space that is fundamentally designed to make the savior's quality of life visible without making it accessible. They can see the difference, they can see what's available to the people above them. They're not kept in ignorance about the disparity. The theory is that this is intentional, and Negan understood it. Keeping workers in ignorance of their conditions produces resentment when they discover the truth, while keeping them aware of the conditions produces aspiration, the desire to become a savior, to move up, to be one of the people with access to the better resources. The architecture produces compliance through desire rather than through ignorance, which is more durable. This is not an original management technique. It's basic behavioral economics. And the theory is that Negan, the former teacher who designed feudalism, understood it. I don't think the show ever says this explicitly, but it's in everything. Every community that survives long-term in this show is a community that grieves together. And every community that fractures, that implodes, that turns on itself or becomes something monstrous, they're communities that stopped making room for loss. That demanded people be functional before they were ready. That treated grief as a liability rather than something that needs to go somewhere. The theory is that the show has a very specific argument here. Grief is not a weakness that civilization has to manage around. It's actually a structural part of how communities hold together. When you mourn someone collectively, you're doing something real, affirming that person mattered, that the bonds between you are real and costly, that loss means something. Communities that skip that step, that tell their people to be operational immediately, are quietly communicating that the bonds aren't worth the time. And communities where the bonds don't matter don't last. The Walking Dead is full of evidence for this, and I find it one of the most quietly true things the show says. This is the theory that explains why the Shane was right energy that surrounds Season 1 and 2 extends, with modifications, to the Negan era. Negan was not designed to be simply defeated, he was designed to be right about enough things that his being wrong about everything else would matter. He was right that a community without consistent rules will fracture. He was right that soft leadership gets people killed. He was right that the tribute system was more functional than open warfare between small communities. He was wrong about the specific price those rights were purchased at, and wrong about whether the price was sustainable, and wrong about what a community that maintains itself through fear eventually becomes. But the show built him to win the argument long enough that Rick's eventual victory over him feels like a choice rather than an inevitable outcome. That choice is what makes the story worth telling. Not adapt, change. There is a difference, and it matters for this theory. Adapting means adjusting your behaviour to new conditions while maintaining your core values or psychology. Changing means something more fundamental, revising your beliefs about what's true and what's possible. Every other major character in the show adapts. Rick adapts his leadership style. Daryl adapts his relationship to community. Carol adapts her methods, but their core psychological orientations remain continuous. Morgan twice actually changes. He goes from a man who believes in survival through isolation to a man who believes in survival through community, and then from a man who believes that all life is sacred to a man who accepts that some killing is necessary, and then back, and then forward again. These are genuine revisions of belief, not adaptations of method. The theory is that Morgan's arc is the show's proof of concept for actual human change, and that the reason his journey is so uncomfortable to watch is that real change is always uncomfortable. It requires acknowledging that what you believed before was wrong. The last images of the main series, Judith and R.J. Grimes, children born in the apocalypse, looking out at a world they will eventually inherit, are the show's answer to the question it has been building towards since Rick woke up in the hospital. The question was never, can civilization be saved? The question was, can we buy enough time for the people who might actually be able to build something to survive long enough to try? Rick's answer, from the moment he found his son and began organizing communities, was yes. Carl was that generation. When Carl died, the answer moved to Judith. And Judith, the theory argues, is where it was always going, to the first person who doesn't carry the weight of what was lost, who only carries the knowledge of what's been built, who can look at the world without grief and ask not, how do we recover what we had, but what do we want to build? The theory is that this was the plan from the beginning. Not Rick's survival, not the defeat of the knee gun, or the Whisperers, or the serum, time. Enough time for a child to grow up and ask the right question. Not Rick and Michonne, though that's in there. Not Maggie and Glenn, though that's in there too. Not any of the specific relationships that the show built with such care across its run. The Walking Dead, at the level of its deepest argument, is a love story about humanity itself. It spent 11 seasons about, and more, counting the spin-offs, asking the most basic question, are people worth saving? Not good people, not the right people, not people who have never done terrible things. People. The whole complicated, grieving, violent, generous, exhausted, stubborn, indispensable category. And the answer the show gives, in every season, even the bad ones, even the ones where the show was clearly struggling with its own weight, is the same. Yes, they are worth it. Judith and RJ are worth it. The anonymous person who barricaded Rick's door is worth it. Bob laughing about tainted meat is worth it. Herschel holding a lantern up in the prison is worth it. The bicycle woman crawling toward the hospital is worth it. Yes, they are worth saving. The dead walk and the living walk alongside them. And somehow, stubbornly, beautifully, that is enough. So that's 150 theories. And I want to be honest with you, I could keep going. There are theories I didn't have time for tonight. The full comic timeline, and how it does and doesn't map onto the show. The specific question of what a post-CRM world actually looks like from the ground. The theories about whether the franchise has a coherent ending planned or whether it's still finding one. I've got a long list, we'll get to more of it. But for tonight, this is probably a good place to stop. It's late, or it isn't late, and you're watching this at a perfectly reasonable hour, in which case, good for you, you're making better decisions than most of my audience. The Walking Dead is a show that rewarded attention. Not always. There are seasons where it doesn't reward anything except patience. But when it was working, when it had time and care and the right people making the right calls, it was genuinely one of the most intelligent pieces of television about what people are, about what we do to each other when the structures that usually manage that fall away, about what survives. I've got a whole video in the works about the comic timeline specifically, the ways Kirkman's original story diverged from the show, and what those divergences tell you about what each version was actually trying to say. That's coming, at some point. For now though, get some